What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time is 3:15 p.m., July 14th, 2024. Going live for the second time today. Go check out the previous live stream I did on my cell phone talking about assassination, political legitimacy, and condoning violence. We're going hard on this channel talking about topics that other YouTubers don't talk about. We're also keeping it intellectual. This channel shall be a library for people that want to be educated, people that want to learn about new topics, people that want to challenge their preconceived notions, and people that actually want to learn, just in general. I take my job as an educator, as an English teacher seriously, and I also take this hobby that I have with my YouTube channel to educate myself and try to enlighten the public as well and learn with the people. Too Trappy jumped into the comment section. I will be reading all the comments as they appear. He said, yes, they are. And I would argue that, yes, the Turks are white because they participated in the type of racial science that predominated in the early 20th century, where people were saying all sorts of crazy things like whiteness and modernity were tied together. There was a continuation of a certain race of people that promoted civilization more than others and that sort of stuff. All that sort of pseudoscience that we have now thrown into the dustbin of history that we all unanimously conclude to be false and to be misleading and to be detrimental to actually having constructive conversations about race and fighting white supremacy and that sort of stuff and the abolition of race in general. Yes, so the Turks are whites, if that's the case. And that's what we were reading last time. Before we jump back into the book, this is the book that you can find on Amazon right here, Is the Turk a White Man?, written by Murat Ergin, published in 2018. You can pick it up for the humble price of only $30. This is not a paid endorsement. Murat, if you're watching this, please know that I support your work. I'm trying to promote your work, and I encourage everybody to still buy the book and reach their own conclusions from it. In the Book React series, we are just reacting to the text as we see it. No different than if somebody were reacting to a TV show or another YouTuber or a song, whatever, anything like that. Anyway, I'm picking up here in chapter 4. We're sort of at the tail end of chapter 4, a very long chapter that was about 80 pages or so. And yeah, what we were reading last time is essentially after the end of the Ottoman Empire, the new Republicans created a new type of nationalism for Turks that was centered around Turkishness. But they needed to create the idea of Turkishness to begin with, because during the Ottoman Empire there was no, how can I say, this central idea of what a Turk was, right? They just viewed themselves as Ottomans, a part of the, Islamic Caliphate, and a part of a multi-linguistic, multi-ethnic, multi-racial, quote unquote, empire and that sort of stuff. But the Republicans, brought in by Ataturk and that sort of stuff, they needed to create this new idea. So in the last part that we read yesterday for about 1 hour, essentially the leaders of the new republic put all the academics, the teachers of high school students, migrated from Central Asia after creating a great civilization there. But then there was a flood or some sort of climate change that caused the Turks to move out of Central Asia into the Middle East. And they were the basis, the bedrock for Persian civilization, Sumerian civilization, Hittite civilization, Egyptian civilization, and stuff like that. And then when other academics tried to fight against this idea, or even just say, let's not rush to judgment with this new creation of history, they were all silenced, or they were all pressured into going along with the main narrative. And the main point of this narrative was to fight against the characterization of the Turks done by the West, saying that the Turks were backwards, they were savages, they were less than white people, because the Western Europeans were doing pseudoscience at the time, saying that there were different races of people with different characteristics, and the white race was at the top. The Turks were trying to fight against that to some degree by saying, no, we actually come from a glorious past. We were all kings and queens and that sort of stuff. And then also at the same time, still trying to tie themselves to whiteness and to modernity to some degree, right? That was the point of yesterday's reading for this chapter. Basically, the Turks are crafting a new narrative for themselves and a new identity for themselves going into the 20th century. So I'm going to pick up from this paragraph right here and then run through chapter 4 and then hopefully finish chapter 5 before my class at 6 today. So y'all jump into the comment section, leave comments, leave your takes on this, and let's learn. So zooming in right here real quick. All right. The new history tried to link Republican Turks to distant achievements with a usually confusing array of historical, linguistic, racial, and national messages. The efforts to erase the legacy of the terrible Turk took place so urgently and desperately that the scholarly mobilization for investigating racial essences used questionable methods. The search for anthropometric essences began with locating internationally recognized achievements and then proceeding to invent historical proof that the people accomplishing such a feat must be of Turkish origin. Because demonstrating the modernizing capacity of the Turks was a major goal, anthropometric research sought civilizational advances that were valued in modern standards. According to this logic, the first step was to identify achievements of modern civilization and then to link these achievements to ancient Turks. For example, writing was a great gift to civilization, therefore, Turks must have invented it. Metallurgy was the basis of modern industry. Therefore, it was important to show that Turks pioneered mining and metalwork. Women's suffrage was becoming an important movement in the West. In fact, women's inferior role in public life had given ammunition to Western critics of Turkey since the late Ottoman period. Therefore, ancient Turkish societies must have achieved complete equality between men and women. Popular participation in ancient Turkish societies, according to this narrative, resembled modern democracies, yet they successfully avoided anarchy by never giving concessions from the tight enforcement of public order. This image of an orderly society operating under popular participation suited well to the autocratic tendencies on the regime. It justified tight government control while sustaining the rhetoric of popular participation. Islam in the West was perceived as an obstacle to progress. Therefore, it was important to show that the original religions of the Turks were totemism, shamanism, and animism. Islam was only a religion that came from the outside. These statements functioned as pieces in a puzzle, constituting a larger whole while eliminating the effectiveness of counter statements. All these civilizational statements relied on a racial continuity of Turkishness, presenting Turks as essentially white and European. The anthropometric search for the Turkish essences, as it was the case with the biometric counterpart, developed as a critique of Western epistemic injustices. In the minds of Republican modernizers, respect and yearning for a sought after Western modernity always coupled with a deep resentment for the West. If one reason for this resentment was the perils of ultramodernity, the other was the perceived stubbornness of the West to relegate Turkey permanently to the status of traditional. Modernity for the reformers was not only a consequence of contemporary condition, but also an essential racialized characteristic embedded in one's collective identity. The former required the latter. Going to the West was only possible by going to the East. John Dewey observed the same point in his metaphorical understanding of the regime's moving of the capital from Istanbul to Ankara in 1923. I shall try to preserve that feeling which came upon me in the first hours of seeing Ankara, that its selection as a capital and the will to build a center of government far away from the memories and traditions of Constantinople is a heroic venture, symbolizing faith in the possibilities of the Asiatic peasant. It is paradoxical that it should be necessary for a nation to go into Asia in order to make sure that it is to be Europeanized. But the leaders at least wish that Turkey be Europeanized in their own way and for their own benefit. So the thing is about Turkey, right? The biggest city is Istanbul, but the capital is Ankara, right? Similar to how in the US we have Washington, D.C., which is the physical capital of the US, but New York City is the cultural capital of America, the financial capital of America, the economic hub of America, right? So Turkey, when they moved their capital to Ankara, were trying to some degree, move away from the past of the Ottomans and also try to modernize as well. Because creating Ankara was supposed to be a way for them to start anew, start fresh, and also centralize power to some degree. That's my reaction to that. The anthropometric scholarship was correct in observing the underlying partiality of the putatively impartial Western science. Behind all the rage about science was an almost instinctive understanding that, as a human construction, it was shaped by contemporary racial views. The information that Western scientists provide on humanity and human races is from their own points of view. They usually classify races according to the goals that they pursue. However, this embryonic anti Orientalist voice in the critique of Western race science disappeared in the cacophony of anthropometric statements seeking an objective and scientific basis for chromatic Turkishness. For Afet Inan, that's Ataturk's adopted daughter, The Society of History and Language operated as sibling institutions, quote unquote. This was seen in other domains as well. Research and reforms in language complemented the historical mobilization in the 1930s. The Republican search for the Turks' linguistic roots and essences constituted a significant part of the anthropometric project. One leg of the language reform, the script reform of 1928, discarded the Ottoman script in the span of a few years and, consequently, severed links with the Ottoman past in collective memory. Even the script reform was seen as an act of going back to Turkish roots. The reformers insisted in calling the new script the new Turkish alphabet, although, with the exception of a few invented characters, it replicated the Latin alphabet. The government instituted the so called schools for the nation for the sole purpose of teaching the general public the new script. The government's official book of regulations in 1928 required the institution of two types of schools: a 4-month course for illiterate and a 2-month course for those who could read and write in the Ottoman script. A decree in 1929 revised this arrangement by extending the 2-month course to 4 months, during which citizens would receive civic knowledge. The switch to the new scripts was sudden. The law on the new alphabet, enacted on November 1928, required the use of the new script in all government offices by January 1929. Publishing an extension was given for certain offices until June 1929. Publishing had to be done with the new alphabet starting January 1929. The second significant component of language reform, the purification of the language, was an instance of ambitious social engineering. The pure Turkish movement existed since the late Ottoman era, but gained official recognition in the Republican period. This establishment of the Turkish Linguistic Association was an important momentum builder. As an organ of the state, the association started a campaign to collect and publish lists of vocabulary. The list presumably contained unadulterated folk language from ancient sources. While these words were expected to replace Turkish vocabulary from foreign sources, the association also engaged in inventing new vocabulary for the same purpose. The shift was so radical that for a Turkish speaker today, it is almost equally challenging to understand the Ottoman Turkish language of the 1920s and the purified invented language of the 1930s. Linguistic interventionism contained forward and backward looking projects. The former concentrated on improving the existing language through purification and invention, whereas the latter strived to establish the ancientness of the Turkish language. Congresses and conferences played an important role in these projects. Almost immediately after its establishment in the July of 1932, the Turkish Linguistic Association convened the first Turkish Congress of Language from September 26th to October 5th of 1932. Even a cursory examination of the presentations in the Congress reveals the complementary efforts of purification and uncovering ancient roots. The first few days, the presenters paid attention to the ancientness of the Turkish language, while the following days were more intensely dedicated to the efforts of purification. The idea of ridding a language of foreign influences assumes that the language in question has a natural state of being in the past, and that this state can be recovered by linguistic research. The twin searches for purity and essences constituted the backbone of racial, historical, and linguistic mobilizations. In racial scholarship, the biometric project was after racial purity, whereas anthropometric scholarship sought ancient essences. In language, the forward looking project of purification corresponds to racial biometrics. In the new history movement, purifying the Republic's narrative of existence from all foreign influence, including the Ottoman past, complemented the forward looking project of building a modern and European identity. Modernization as purity in the present condition was thought to require uncovering a historical essence in a timeless past. Racial, historical, and linguistic mobilizations served a modernization that was possible and desirable because of the correspondence between the past and present states of being. Racial improvement was intended to match the pure Turkishness of the past. Purifying language meant recovering a pure Turkishness in a timeless past, and contemporary achievements would only be possible with the help of historically uncovered Turkish strength. The influences of roots and essences in this discursive framework were circuitous. So basically, I believe this is one of the most important paragraphs here. Basically, what he's saying here is that in the Republican moment, like during the early 20th century, those 1920s, 1930s, in that era, they were trying to Modernized Turkey, and in a sense, modernization was seen as purification, going back to the true essence of the Turks. But the perverse thing is that this modernization that they were trying to do was coupled with this idea that they were always modern, but they sort of like lost their way by getting too caught up into Ottomanism and Islamism and that sort of thing. So they're trying to purge all of these foreign influences, the Arabic script, the language, the culture, and all of that sort of stuff, and at the same time trying to become European, trying to become modernized to some degree, but then also at the same time preserve the folk ideas, right? And those two things are very tied into the purity and sanctity of like whiteness in a sense, right? Because the white supremacists at the time and the white supremacists now believe that they are pure stock of the people that created the most civilization, have done the most civilizing across the planet, and that sort of stuff, and that their languages have some sort of purity to them as well. And this is the same type of project that the Turks at this time were trying to do, modernize but also purify their society at the same time in a converse way, in a perverse type of way. All right, that's how I'm looking at this. That's my reaction to this. A very hard concept to wrap your mind around, but very fascinating when you think about it. All right, linguistic research had direct bearings on the civilizational claims of the elite. It is a great honor. A speaker linking Sumerian and modern Turkish languages announced in his presentation at the Language Congress to have given civilization to the entire humanity. It has been unacceptable for them, the representatives of the Indo European group, to leave this honor to the Turks, whom they viewed as barbarians until then. When combined with the pressures to produce knowledge that was both complementary and competitive with the West, the excitement of the First Congress resulted in outlandish claims. Referring to German scholars who used the term Indo Germanic, a presenter suggested replacing the term Indo European with Turco European. Another speaker claimed that the Arabic word for Allah had a Turkish origin in the word el, hand, because in ancient times the greatest force known in the world was the Turk's hand and the Turk's fist. Okay, that's crazy. That's crazy. That's literally crazy. Ataturk's involvement in the preparation of the Congress and his attendance during several presentations illustrates the official support for the linguistic mobilization. All the presenters hailed the leaders. All the presenters hailed the leader in their lectures with respectful statements, even when Ataturk was not present in the room. Disagreement and dissent in the Congress were virtually absent. The greatest amount of protest took place when one of the presenters attempted to emphasize the characteristics of language as a social institution, criticizing extreme interventionism in language. After four angry and lengthy critiques from other participants, Yalchin appeared in the podium once more, blamed everything on misunderstandings, and emphasized that he and others do not, in fact, have any disagreements. This pattern of initial cautious critique, angry responses from the audience, and a final apologetic explanation to reaffirm agreement was also repeated in the Congress of History. The Second Congress of Turkish Language took place in 1934 in a more controlled environment, which prevented even the type of apologetic oppositions that were witnessed in the first Congress. The rules and regulations for the Congress stipulated that only the members of the Turkish Linguistic Association and those invited by the association could present papers, and that comments on presentations were outside the goals of the Congress. Despite all the precautions, it appears that there was opposition in the Second Congress. The conference president interrupted Chafaroglu Ahmed's presentation, apparently for including points that went against the grain of the official ideology, although the details are unclear because the section of the records were censored. The dominant themes of the First Congress repeatedly appeared in the Second Congress. The efforts for the purification of the Turkish language went hand in hand with the search for its roots in all corners of the world, from Central Asia to ancient Mesopotamia, from Europe to South America. An interesting paper by Tahsin Omer, a consular employee at the Turkish embassy in Mexico, focused on phonetic similarities between various Mayan and Turkish words, finally claiming that ancient civilizations in Mexico were created by Central Asian Turks who had migrated to South America. In the following few years, Mayetepek revised his thesis in considerable ways. A large body of correspondence between Mayetepek as the Turkish ambassador in Mexico City and the officials of the Turkish Linguistic Association reveals the details of his theory. According to Mayetepek, a lost continent of Mu existed in the Pacific Ocean until it sank 11,500 years ago. Basing his claims on the work of a British writer of the supernatural, James Churchward, Mayatepek argued that an even earlier cradle of civilization existed before Central Asia, that the ancient inhabitants of the continent of Mu, who were the same racial stock as contemporary Turks, spread civilization across the world starting 70,000 years ago, and that Uyghur, Akkadian, and Sumerian Turks, who were the original inhabitant of Mu, supplied the ancient essence of all Aryan races and languages in Europe. The theory of the continent Mu did not receive much support from the official circles, perhaps because his claims were too extreme even by the standards of the day. The lure of the Turkishness of Mayans, however, was too great to pass, and the idea occasionally emerged in scholarly publications. This makes me think so much of like some of the mythology in like the Nation of Islam, where they say, thousands and thousands of years ago, there was a highly advanced civilization called the tribe of Shabazz, and they spread civilization to different parts. And then that there was a like mad scientist named Yakub who had a big brain who went to the island of Crete to create the white race through genetic manipulation and stuff like that. It makes me think so much of some of the pseudoscience that perpetrates and permeates in the Hotep black community and the woke community and stuff like that. Not saying that every woke person or every Hotep is a conspiracy theorist or a pseudoscientist or pseudo historian, right? But it's funny how people have this natural reaction to having their cultures and their history denigrated. So they respond by overemphasizing or hyperbolizing their own history and own culture, right? So, continuing here, the Third Turkish Congress of Language witnessed the attempts to solve a paradox. A number of Turkish scholars were aware that the efforts to classify the Turkish language simultaneously as Indo-European, Semitic, and Altaic made the purification campaigns moot. Giving the Turks the credit for almost all linguistic and civilizational accomplishments, after all, implied that the so-called foreign words in the language all had Turkish origins. The Congress was a turning point in eliminating the potentially divisive debates on purification. It was not unusual for some scholar to subsume the disparaged Islamic or Ottoman civilizational achievements under Turkishness. In the first Congress, for example, a presenter concluded the main stepping stones of the Ottoman literature, too, were set by men belonging to our great race. The Turk owns the greatest rights in the science and poetry of Islamic civilization, regardless of which language was used for that poetry and science. Until 1936, it was not clear whether Islamic and Ottoman past would be purified from or included in the category of Turkishness. A broad net of putative roots for the Turkish language undermined the efforts to rid the language of its foreign vocabulary, because if Turkish were really the source of virtually all languages, nothing, including the most disdained Arabic and Persian words, could be considered foreign. The solution in the Third Congress turned out to be the Sun language theory. Wow. According to the theory, historical and linguistic data indicated the existence of a single originary language that was the source of all other languages. The first natural object that stimulated ancient humans to utter words, according to the theory, was the sun. The first phoneme that emerged as a result of the sun's astonishing presence was Aj. Okay, the sun for primitive humans represented warmth and the basis of life, which in turn created totemic worshiping. Human language developed out of this single phoneme when ancient humans experienced slow evolutionary changes and acquired better biological means for speech. The heart of the thesis was concerned with the origin of the first humans and the first language. According to the theory, both historical and linguistic data clearly prove that Turkish origins of humanity. Migrations carried the language of ancient Brassiphilic Turks across the world. Despite its obvious problems, the theory received enthusiastic support. Presentations at the Third Congress of Language were reserved almost completely for formulating the Sun language theory, a textbook of the Turkish language intended for the students at the Faculty of Language and History, Geography in Ankara spent virtually the entire book to the premises of the Sun language theory. In addition, a number of publications appeared in support of the theory. The development of the Sun language theory was clearly a relief from the chaotic experience of purification between 1932 and 1936, which had resulted in a synthetic language highly variable from individual to individual. In an effort to serve the nation, authors replaced Arabic and Persian words with their putatively Turkish equivalents they individually produced, usually ending up in sentences that others could not decipher. Although the new theory slowed down purification, not everyone agreed that it should stop completely. Some scholars at the Turkish Linguistic Association were aware of the consequences of the theory for purification. The General Secretary of the Society, Ibrahim Nesmin Dilmen, an active member in the development of the theory, discussed the issue in his speech at the Third Congress, arguing that the Sun language theory was not simply an attempt to keep foreign words in the Turkish language. Sorry, was not simply an attempt to keep foreign words in the Turkish language. Purification efforts, according to Dillman, had to continue to a certain extent. All right, this is a crazy theory. Once again, the idea that, okay, they just sort of like pulled it out of their butt. They literally pulled it out of their butt. Like, yeah, a long time ago, humans worshiped the sun. And coincidentally, the first word that humans came up for the sun was the Turkish word aj, right? And I imagine that aj or ag, I don't know exactly how to say it, is the, Turkish word they use for the sun. So this is what they're trying to say. Like, Turks were the creators of language because the word sun is so basic, so primitive that, yeah, this was how humans developed language. And from there, all other languages developed. What a crazy theory. Like, they literally were just making up stuff. This was the type of science that was being done at the early 20th century. Early 20th century. Anyway, continuing here, the authorship of the Sun language theory is not clear. The official lore gives the credit to the genius of Ataturk, in particular, and the intelligence of the Turk in general. In fact, the two were considered to be practically the same, since the cult of Ataturk portrayed him as the personal manifestation of all the qualities of the Turkish intellect. Beyond the rhetorical appeals regarding its Turkish discovery, however, it was necessary to give scientific credibility to the theory in order to convince Western scholars and publics of the Turks' contribution to world civilization. 15 foreign scholars from various countries, such as Britain, Austria, Poland, Japan, the USSR, and Hungary, attended the Third Congress. There is no question that these scholars were handpicked based on their expected support for the theory. Correspondence among the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Turkish Linguistic Association, and various Turkish embassies in European capitals reveal a frantic search for Western experts friendly to the Turkish theses. The government covered all the expenses for Western experts, including travel and accommodation. Among the Western experts, Austrian linguist Hermann Fyodor Kverjic played a critical role in the development of the theory. The Turkish Society for Language and the Turkish Consulate in Vienna acted in close cooperation in securing Kervich's support. In a letter to the Turkish ambassador in Vienna, the General Secretary of the Society of Language expressed his concerns that Kervich seemed more interested in comparing the Turkish language with Far Eastern languages such as Mongolian, and asked the ambassador to caution Kervich as to the necessity to study Turkish in the context of great European and Asian languages. Kervich's presentation at the Congress supported the Sun language theory, but this was to be expected because his acceptance letter acknowledged upfront his sympathy for the theory. So basically, at this time, once again, during this process of modernization, the Turks are trying to purify their language, rid it of all the elements that they don't like, the Arabic, the Persian, and trying to include it, put it right next to the great European languages. Now, think about this. If the Central Asian cultures or civilizations were at the pinnacle at the time, right? If Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan were seen like European nations were at this time, the Turks will be fighting hard to say, oh, look, compare Turkish to the great Mongolian civilization, compare it to the Kazakh civilization, all that sort of stuff. But because of the time era that they were living in, they were saying, no, we're just as good as Polish. We're just as good as Russian. We're just as good as English and French and all that sort of stuff. In fact, all these great European languages really come from Turkish. It shows the sort of brainwashing that was done to these people. It shows the sort of, how can I say this, the effects of white supremacy and the effects of colonialism upon these people as well. Even though Turkey was never colonized, they were living in the age of colonialism and the spread and propagation of white supremacist ideas and that sort of stuff. So we're just going to continue with that. All right. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. We got to clear out some anti-black racists in this thing. All right. Continuing here. The 1930s witnesses two important congresses on Turkish history that complemented linguistic efforts and canonized the so-called Turkish historical thesis. The Korpulu and Togan incidents, as discussed in the beginning of this chapter, illustrate how a racial conception of Turkishness was taking over the academic circles. These were moments when the definition of the situation was on a knife's edge, which suggests that a different conception of identity was possible. However, the strong reactions to cautious critiques made sure that neither the congresses of history nor other scholarly activities of the period turned into genuine forms of academic exchange where dissent was tolerated. More significantly, we witnessed the discursive power of racial conceptions and imageries, placing serious limitations on what could be said within the confines of the taxonomic ideology. Statements that went against the grain of a particular discourse of Turkishness and its classificatory agenda were either deemed irrelevant or taken as hostile arguments. Apart from two apologetic cautions that drowned in the excitement of pseudoscience, lectures at the First Congress of History in 1932 showed direct correspondence with the historical, racial, and linguistic goals of the period. Outlined in the opening speech by the Minister of Education, the image of the West always loomed large in the horizon of scholarly production, manifesting itself in a love-hate relationship that characterized the Republican period. Although the work of European and North American scholars constituted an ultimate source of legitimacy, there were also seen with suspicion. There was not only a product of idea of Western injustices that shaped Ottoman and Turkish modernization, but also originated from the fact that Western race science traditionally classified Turks into the category of yellow race, or the Mongoloids. In order to refute this view, the General Secretary of the Society of History and the prospective Minister of Education, Recep Galip, gave a long presentation on the history of Turkish race and civilization, with the sole purpose of devising a racial classification that would classify Turks in the category of white Europeans. Recep Galip's lecture presented a list of Western scientific publications classifying the Turks as Mongoloids, and confronted them with another set of Western scientific work that traced the origin of Turks to Brachycephalic Alpine Europeans. So here are the Turks, one of the Turkish intellectuals at the time at a large conference, saying, no, we are not Mongoloids. No, we are not yellow. We are white, white, white, white. We are white. All right, continuing here. I would like to pay attention to a moment in this lecture when the speaker broke convention and revealed the concern behind the science talk. It took place when Recep Galip was criticizing a certain Dr. Vanal and his classificatory system, which identified the Turks as members of the yellow race. The speaker turned to the audience and offered a fantastically self-referential piece of evidence. In order to disprove the classification theory following in this work beyond any doubt, it is sufficient, I believe, for those who are present here as part of the Turkish race to take a look at one another. So he's saying, everybody, listen, guys, let's stop the science. Take a look at your left. Take a look at your right. What do you see? The look at me, I am white attitude still has resonance in contemporary Turkey, which I will discuss in chapter 6. The thin but emotionally powerful appeal of self-referential evidence reached its epitome when Şevket Aziz Kansu, the eminent anthropology professor with an inclination toward race science and eugenics, displayed four skulls during his presentation on the anthropology of Turks, building his argument on visual testimony. Of course, you see these four skulls that I randomly selected from among approximately 2,000 classified skulls in my laboratory. These are samples that we can hold in our hands of the group of humanity called the Alpines. And it is not me, but these skulls themselves that will tell you to where and to whom they belong. Applause. That's wild. That's wild. Avery Adams jumped into the chat. He said, good morning, good afternoon. And my reply to you is günaydın in Turkish. Günaydın, which means good morning to wherever you are. Anyway, crazy that the Turks were like at this conference where they're talking about history. They turn and look at each other and say, what do you look like? Do you look white? Yeah, I look white. What do you look like? I look white. Yeah, I look white. And he's like, see, that's enough proof. That's enough proof. Once again, race is a social construct. It's only surface level. There is no difference between a white person and a black person when it comes to our biology, if any at all, right? Not at all. Not at all. Actually, none. Zero. Zilch. None. We are all part of the human race, the human species. But at this time, in the 20th century, and in the 20s and 30s of this century, these people were doing this sort of race science where they were standing out in front of the conference, pulled out the skull of a white man, pulled out the skull of a Turkish man, and said, "See, we're just as good as them." Sick, absolutely sick. All right. After presenting various tables for the purpose of comparing the craniometrical characteristics of the New Caledonian, the African Negro, the Neolithic man, the French, and the Turk, and establishing similarities between French and Turkish skulls, Kansu, in a way common for the Republican anthropometric science, interpreted similarity as a proof that the Turkish race stood at the origin of the Alpine European race. This Turkish type is identical to the Alpine man called European. Now it is necessary to ask a question. From where did this type we call European come? And are you going to connect this Turkish type to Europe or Europe to it? Let's immediately answer without a doubt that brachiocephalic Europe is connected to us. Applause. Crazy, crazy. Once again, think about this. If it were not for Europeans colonizing the entire world, having the Industrial Revolution, using their weapons and means to oppress other groups of people and dominate the way they do, if this were another race of people, if it were the African Negro or the New Caledonian, whose skull was seen as the epitome of human civilization, the Turks will be trying to compare their skulls to this one. This is crazy. Once again, it's crazy to think how far science has come, but also still, to some degree, that there are people that believe in this science. There are people, when you go on Twitter, when you go on 4chan, when you go on YouTube even, you can find people who say, because somebody's skull is shaped a certain way, or because they have a certain brain size, or because they are of a certain race, they are naturally more intelligent, less intelligent, more civilized, less civilized. These ideas still permeate today, to some degree. And that's the sad part about this. But the crazy thing is how institutionalized it was at this time, because the Turks were literally trying to build themselves up by saying, we are white. They were creating the whiteness for themselves. They were creating themselves in the model of the Europeans that they were trying to mimic so much, that looked down on them. Because all of these congresses, all of these conferences, all of these meetings that they're putting together to create the new Turkish history and preserve and purify the Turkish language, it was all a response to Europeans who were saying that they were mongoloids, yellow men, and that they were savages. That's crazy. That's literally crazy. Continuing here. The next step for Kansu was to organize a spectacle of a family of Anatolian peasants as representatives of unchanged racial characteristics of Turks. This theatrical display of racial analogy, mimicking a museum of natural history, attracted joyous support from the audience. Kansu made the following passionate remarks after a family of four appeared on the podium. Gentlemen, if you allow me, I will show you a Turkish family without pursuing a selective mentality. By coincidence, I found and brought to you a young woman and a young man with their small children. Let me show you. I present Abdullah, his wife and small child from the village of Bajlum, a little bit to the north of Ankara. Here is a pure man of the mountains with a thin and long nose, braciocephalic and described with these characteristics in anthropology books. The Alpine man, the Turkish man. Applause. Abdullah has eyes that are not dark, a light brown mustache, and a lighter than wheat, and white skin. Sorry, he has a light brown mustache that is lighter than wheat and a white skin. But here are his children. The child with golden hair belongs to the Turkish race. Applause. They're clapping because the man has a blonde baby. Think about that. The scientific Turks are sitting here clapping because this Turkish man had a blonde baby. Crazy. All right. But here is his children. The child with his golden hair belongs to the Turkish race. Here is the Alpine man, the man who came from Central Asia, the man who is linked to our ancestors. Applause. So once again, I think it's kind of crazy that in a lot of societies, they look at the poor and dispossessed peasants as being the purest of people, right? I think we have this same mentality in America too, where they say the true Americans, the heartland of America, is like Bob, Jill, and their 2.5 kids, and the dog with the picket fence represents like the true America, right? The cowboy, the poor man, that sort of stuff. It seems it's very eerily similar to like how Americans think about us as a people, right? To some degree. And I'm pretty sure a lot of other countries have this too, where they view the the rural people as being more true to foreign, more true to the culture of this nation and that sort of stuff. When a lot of the times I would argue that's not true. Like poor people, people who live in rural parts, are just as influenced by foreign cultures and can have various backgrounds. Just like people in the city. Anyway, crazy that you would just grab this random family and present them to the audience as proof of the Turks' whiteness, right? And also proof of the idea that Turks were the original people, right? That they have alpine features, the aquiline noses, high cheekbones, and blonde hair, right? And the people are like clapping for this. Absolutely crazy. Continuing here. Decades later, the physical characteristics Kansu described turned into cultural resources in the competitive urban economy of contemporary Turkey and became part of individuals' physical capital. So basically, what he's saying, like, the blonde hair that the little girl had, and the straight aquiline nose, and the light hair on his face, and white skin, right? These are things that are now valued and cherished amongst Turkish society. Continuing here, other presentations energetically supplied the anthropometric project with a variety of peculiar claims. Hasan Cemil, for example, presented the views on the Turkish origins of the Mediterranean and Aegean civilization, demanding credit for the civilizational achievements of ancient Greeks and other peoples of the antiquity. Yusuf Zia took a similar path and tried to establish the Turkish origins of the ancient Egyptians. Ahmet Agolu's presentation manufactured historical, racial, and linguistic bridges between Indo-Europeans and Turks. Afet Inan, in her speech, followed the migration of Asiatic Turks into Europe, drawing a broad picture of Turkish contribution and superiority in the Middle Ages. Yusuf Hikmet portrayed a history of the Ottomans as the sole accomplishment of its Turkish population. The domestic atmosphere in the First Congress sharply contrasted with the international orientation of the Second Congress, held in the September of 1937. In the First Congress, only one non-Turkish scholar, a Hungarian historian, participated, although the presence of Western scientific discourses made their presence felt in references to the publications of European and North American scholars. In the Second Congress, Western scholars authored more than half, 43 out of the total of 74 of the presentations. This number includes 7 presentations that appeared in the proceedings of the conference, although they were not presented to the audience either because of insufficient time or because their authors sent the papers later than the acceptance deadline. The Turkish Society of History published the proceedings six years after the Congress. Moreover, the honorary president of the Congress was Eugene Pittard, a Swiss scholar at the University of Geneva, who would also later be Afet Inan's thesis advisor. The number of presentations was substantially higher compared to the first Congress, but therefore the organizers had to run 2 parallel sessions. Section A included subject matter from the prehistoric ages to the Middle Ages, and Section B covered everything after the Middle Ages to the contemporary period. The dominant disciplines in the Congress were archaeology, anthropology, and prehistory. Ataturk again was involved personally in the organization of the Congress and attended several sessions. The first Congress 5 years ago had attempted to contribute to the domestic mobilization. By the time the Second Congress of History convened in 1937, the new racial, historical, and linguistic claims were firmly established among educated circles and had made their way into textbooks. Therefore, the goal in the Second Congress was more geared toward acquiring international scientific recognition for Turco-centric scholarship. Most of the lectures, directly or indirectly, referred to Turkish history. However, the efforts to present the Congress as a truly international affair was obvious, not only in the invitation of Western scholars, but also in the inclusion of a variety of technical subjects that went beyond the immediate interest area of Central Asia and Anatolia. In his opening speech, the Minister of Education and the chairman of the Congress, Safet Arikan, stated that the duty of the Turkish Historical Society was not only to investigate Turkish culture, but also the original cultures of all civilized nations. The involvement of an increased number of scholars, as well as the inclusion of different subject matter, however, did not lead to an environment of discussion and debate. On the contrary, even apologetic objections were not able to carve a discursive space in the Second Congress. The design of the Congress only allowed presentations that were included in the conference program. Even if the design were appropriate for debate and dissent, the chances for its actual occurrence would have been small, because the Republican discursive framework effectively effectively privileged scientific certainty over multiplicity of perspective. Historical, linguistic, and racial bases of Turkishness were already resiliently embedded in the efforts of modernization by 1937. The widespread participation by Western scholars only increased the appeal of the anthropometric and biometric statements in the service of creating a conversion narrative in which potential future achievements were mandated by an essence waiting to be discovered in the past. Local scholars in the Second Congress loyally followed the agenda set forth in 1932. Blending history and science with language was easier this time because the Sun language theory was out and in full swing. Praising the Republican linguistic mobilization and showing the significance of the theory in the context of Turkish historical theses was an important goal. Linguist Ibrahim Nechmi Dilmen gave one of these central presentations entitled The Role and Value of the Sun Language Theory in Turkish Historical Theses. One of the founders of Turkish Linguistic Association, Hasan Reçit Tankut, outlined a broader argument in his speech entitled On the Relations Between Language and Race. Another significant goal was to establish links between ancient past and contemporary Turkey. A central line in this regard was to trace the Central Asian origins and hence the Turkishness of ancient Anatolian civilizations. Some took it even further to trace the roots of ancient Greeks to Central Asia. A number of the Turkish scholars dealt with subject matter that were more quote unquote technical and thus contributed to the scientific credibility of the Congress. A paper, for example, presented a detailed analysis of Sumerian mathematics, especially those scholars in the section B presented papers on recent historical periods. Therefore, their data was relatively less appropriate for outlandish claims compared to section A papers that made sweeping claims about a prehistoric ages with scant data. Even technical papers dealing with recent historical data, however, were clearly intended to serve the regime's scholarly mobilization. When historian Kaprulu, for example, defended the existence of a Turkish public law separate from Islamic law in the Middle Ages, this must have supplanted Turco-centric views prevalent in that period and endeared the pride of the Republican modernizers. Shevet Aziz Kansu used the analysis of skulls again to convince the audience of the racial links between contemporary Turks and past civilizations. Analyzing skull remains acquired in excavations, Kansu concluded that Seljuks, a people that invaded Anatolia in the 11th century, were Alpine Turks, and added that Anatolia already hosted Proto-Turks during the Seljuk invasions, thus ensuring the eternal ownership of Anatolia territories. It's very interesting that, because think about this, like the Turks sort of arrived in Anatolia as invaders, horseback invaders, and, this is like now recognized as like the true history. But think about this, like they're trying to make claim to a land that they got through conquest by, saying that they were always there, which is very similar to like what a lot of other cultures do. Like the thing that a lot of people like to say is that the migrants are coming to our ancestral homelands. Everybody across the planet got somewhere because people in the past moved somewhere. People have always been on the move. The eternal movements of people is just a part of human history, right? So the thing about the Turks is like they have to try to claim ownership to Anatolia to try to have some sort of legitimacy to the land and legitimacy to the claim that they were always a modern civilization building people, right? All right. Continuing here, engaging with the regime's scholarly agenda presented greater challenges for foreign participants. Since the organization committee screened all the participants, one could only expect visiting participants to be sympathetic to the Turkish cause. Yet there were different levels in which the support for the Turkish theses was voiced. Several Western scholars were content with remaining on the technical side, paying close attention to detail and avoiding sweeping generalization common among their Turkish counterparts. The fascination with the exotic quote-unquote East and with the new discoveries in the Anatolian Peninsula, common among Western archaeologists and anthropologists, did not immediately translate into grand narratives of Turks spreading civilization from Central Asia to the rest of the world. While European and North American archaeologists were excited about the new findings and supportive of the regime's interest in the past, they were hesitant to link these ancient civilizations with contemporary Turks. French Catholic priest and archaeologist Henri Breuil for example, presented the Anatolian Peninsula as a meeting place for Asian, European, and African cultures. Yet his paper made no references to the origin of these cultures, a much more crucial point for the local scholars. British archaeologist John Garstin focused on Hittite warfare strategies. Turkish scholars by then were confident about the Turkish origins of the Hittites, but Garstang's paper did not include anything in support of the anthropometric claims prevalent in that period. On the other hand, Garstang could not resist the urge to hail Ataturk. The paper included one sentence praising him, maintaining that the military genius of the Hittites could only be matched and exceeded by the chief of the Turks. German archaeologist Walter Andre presented a technical paper on Sumerian art without paying attention to the local fascination with origins. A British historian even started his presentation by announcing that it involved a completely historical subject matter, possibly as a cryptic warning that his technical paper would not meet the ideological expectations. IDK jumped in here. He said, "Hi, man." Shout out to IDK as well. Merhaban. Shout out to all of y'all tuning in who came here to learn and finish up this book with me. Is the Turk a White Man? Written by Murat Ergin. Very fascinating book right here. Basically, what he's talking about for anybody who's tuning in late, the Republicans got together in a big ass room after the end of the Ottoman Empire, and they're trying to rewrite Turkish history and tie in their civilization, their culture, their language, their people to everything that happened in the past that was great, and tying it also closer to Europe and distancing themselves from the Arabs, Persians, and that sort of stuff. So, by the way, IDK said, "Can I ask you something?" You can ask anything. Put the comments, put the question in the chat, and it will be read if it's respectful. If it comes from a good place, right? If you're racist on this channel, you will get blocked. Continuing. So, one of the guests extended the widespread hesitations. All right. IDK says, "What do you think about this Trump stuff?" I've said before, I did a live stream before this live stream talking about the assassination attempt on Trump. To some degree, Trump deserves to get clapped. Assassination is not off the table when it comes to political figures, especially proto-fascists. And we on the left, because hopefully you are on the left on this channel if you're here, because this is a left-wing educational channel, right? You should be considering that as well. We will get free by any means necessary. We will fight fascists. We will fight the totalitarians. We will fight the capitalists on any ground. And assassination should not be off the table. I do not think his assassination attempt will help him get reelected. I still think Biden is on the track to winning. The people that see Trump almost get assassinated and get riled up, those are just his crazy right-wing voters, crazy right-wing supporters who just believe he's already under attack, he's under threat, right? It's not going to make people who said before, like, "Hey, oh man, Trump almost got killed. Maybe we should kill all the immigrants. Hey, Trump almost got killed. Maybe we should make it harder for women to get abortions. Hey, Trump almost got shot. Maybe we should ban teaching Black American history in high schools all across the nation." You get what I'm saying? So IDK says, "I'm so sorry, but Biden shouldn't win. His years are done." Okay, so Trump should win. Trump is only 3 years younger than Biden. Trump is only 3 years younger than Biden, and Trump has mental decline as well. He misstates people's names. He's over here just blatantly lying. He's over here saying anything that comes out of his mouth. Trump is at a mental decline, probably even worse than Biden. And Trump has a lot of baggage, and he's a very violent and dangerous man. That's my opinion, right? And the last comment I'll say about the Trump thing, about his attempted assassination, is that I'm glad the left got shooters. I'm just glad the left got shooters, because for too long the right been doing God knows what to us. All right. So IDK says, "Wait, I'm not from America. What are your options for president?" I suggest everybody vote for Cornel West if you're not in a swing state. Cornel West is a professor, a very astute and renowned professor that I endorse for president. So go vote for Cornel West if you're living in a swing state. If you're a Republican living in California, vote Cornel West if you're black. Do it. Do it. If you're a Democrat or a lefty or a liberal living in a right-leaning state like Arkansas or something, vote Cornel West. But if you're living in Florida, if you're living in Michigan, if you're living in Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, any of those states, you gotta vote blue, because Trump in office could be the end for democracy or whatever proto-democracy we have in America. You get what I'm saying? All right. IDK says, "I'm Bosnian. I can't vote." Yeah. So worry about what's happening in Bosnia. Continuing here. Continuing here, one of the guests extended the widespread hesitations among Western participants and raised a number of open criticisms toward the local theses. In his presentation, Austrian archaeologist Franz Hanchar discussed the recent archaeological finds in the Anatolian Peninsula, but refused to make a connection between Anatolia and Caucasia. Moreover, he voiced his concerns about the haste in dating some of the objects into prehistoric ages. Hanchar's criticisms must have caused quite a stir among the local scholars. Immediately after the presentation, a Turkish archaeologist, Hamit Zubair Koshe, commented on Hanchar's remarks and offered a brief critique, eventually insisting that Hanchar's views in principle did not negate the claims about the links between Caucasia and Anatolia. In a similar incident, the president of the Congress offered comments immediately after a paper by the French paleontologist Henri Victor Valois. Valois's talk embarked on a history and taxonomy of races in Western Asia, but committed to the cardinal sin of classifying the Turks under the Anatolian race instead of the Alpine race. The presidential interjection was respectful but firm. I thank the professor for this very valuable study, but I would like to point out that when discussing the race of the people around our country, he finds it suitable to call them the Anatolian race. Perhaps he uttered these words by relying on Sumerian statues, and he stated that they have large ears. However, statues cannot entirely help us in racial classification. For this reason, I especially would like to draw attention to this point. We are the real Alpine race. And when they're saying real Alpine, they mean real white. They mean real white. An Anatolian race separate from the European type cannot be demonstrated. This was said by Turk Tari Karumu, in original in italics. All right. So, yeah, basically, it's crazy because the Turks were trying as hard as they could to say, we're whites, we're whites, we're whites. And the whites from Europe, their scientists were coming to Turkey and saying, yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah, right. Y'all ain't white. They kept on trying to pigeonhole them. They kept on trying to classify them as, yellow men, mongoloids, less than humans, right? Subhumans to some degree, because the whites were seen as the pinnacle of humans. Continuing here. So, all right. IDK says, or they aren't. I don't know what you mean by or they aren't. This is the thing. Whiteness is not real. But we're asking the question, are Turks participating in the mythology of whiteness? Are they actively trying to pursue that? And what we are seeing from their history is that, yes, the Turks pursued being a part of the construct of whiteness, right? That's what we're seeing from this book. Continuing here, such mechanisms of negotiation and reinterpretation operated in full steam in order to place presentations into their appropriate ideological context and signal. When necessary, that deviation from the main message would not be tolerated. In fact, the grand lens of the new historical, linguistic, and racial theories were so all-encompassing that the presence of Western scholars itself and their interest in Anatolian heritage in the form of excavations, publications, and presentations provided the sufficient legitimation for Turkish theses. Western scholars did not have to openly acknowledge and support the locally valued racial, historical, and linguistic theories. So basically what they're saying is that they just needed white people there to validate them. Right? We got white people in the room while we talked about how we were the original white people. They must agree with it, right? Continuing here. Some of the visiting scholars were more supportive of Turkish claims without the mediation of interpretation and negotiation. Among these scholars, Eugene Pittard, the honorary president of the Congress and the prospective thesis advisor of Afet Inan, had a particularly close relationship with the Turkish elite. In his opening speech on behalf of the Western scholars attending the Congress, Pittard said, "Turkish history is our history as well." The paper he delivered in the Congress was geared toward formulating racial, historical, and linguistic connections between Asia and Europe in the Neolithic age. In a fascinating effort to reverse Western stereotypes and prejudices about the ability of the Turks to modernize, Pitter drew a picture of similarity between ancient Turkic invaders and European colonizers, just as the West had civilized the rest of the world. Turks had civilized the West. Interesting. It appears that if these invaders had not come, the European continent would continue to maintain its appearance belonging to pre-Paleolithic ages, a general appearance that would only adjust in terms of climates and fauna, but would remain the same from the point of view of human scene. We would be living as hunters until this day if a wall similar to the Great Wall of China separated Europe from the rest of the world. When first When the first sailors discovered Australia, Malaysia, and parts of America, they encountered a scene similar to the scene we assumed and imagined. So basically, what Pitzard is trying to say, this French archaeologist saying the rest of the world were savages until Europe showed up. And if there had been a wall built between Europe and Asia, the rest of the world, Europe would be in that case, right? Because Pitzard is supporting the idea that the Turks were like the original creators of civilization, that they were the original whites and all of that stuff and all of that stuff. Now Pritzard is just straight up being racist right here, because saying that the whites discovered Australia, discovered Malaysia, discovered America is hella racist, because there were people living there for thousands of years who built glorious civilizations before the Europeans even knew where these places were on a map. So it's hella racist to some degree. But yes, he is conflating the Turkish conquering of Anatolia as being justified the same way the whites conquering the rest of the world and brutalizing the rest of the world's people as justified as well. Continuing here, in its insistence to trace Eastern origins of Western civilization, Pittard's approach, like many of his Turkish counterparts, may look like an early critique of Orientalism. However, his paper shows that Pittard did not have any intentions to question the boundaries between the East and West. Similar to Turkish scholars, he rather hoped to shift these boundaries with the help of he rather hoped to shift these boundaries with the help of racial classifications and include the Turks under the racially delineated boundaries of the West. A particularly inventive tool for this purpose was to pursue the claim that the essence of European civilization originated in Central Asia. In fact, Pittard's presentation gives subtle messages that equate race and identity and frame both categories in terms of unchanging characteristics. The following sentence, in which Pittard ponders the identity of Asian invaders, is a good example. Now let's examine, who are these men? In other words, to which race can we connect them? Pittard's, in other words, in this sentence, seamlessly links identity to race. Toward the end of his paper, Pittard engages in an analytical stretch of the contemporary period and offers an invaluable scientific gift to the regime by identifying Armenians, Kurds, and the Laz in Turkey as racially Turkish. He carefully distinguished Arabs, which he claimed belonged to a different race. The statements politically resonated with the Republican elite's efforts to establish the eternal Turkishness. Poof. Anyway, IDK says, yeah, it's racist. It's so bad to say that it just sounds stupid. It's very stupid, very stupid. But to say that the Arabs and the Turks are a different race when they look identical shows you that race is not even about looks at all. There is an alternate universe right now where black people and white people are considered the same race. But the only different race is, Asians, the yellow man, or something like that, right? There is an alternate universe where that exists. It's hard for us to imagine that now because we think race is based on phenotypes, that is based on skin color, but it's not. Because the Turks and Arabs have the same skin color, generally the same features. But yet and still they were classified as different races by these racist scientists at the time. Continuing here. Pittard was not alone among the guests who sympathetically supported the Turkish claims. A Swiss anthropologist trained under Pittard, Margret Lobsinger-Dellenbach, continued in Pittard's footsteps in her presentations. Dellenbach, in 1943, produced a map of races across Europe and Asia, classified national groups into races, placing the Turks under braciophilic races, and finally illustrated the migration of the European race from Asia, effectively putting a stamp of approval on the Republican racial and historical views. Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos offered a rather detailed analysis of cultural exchange between ancient Greece and Anatolia, but ended his presentation with a broad statement. The cradle of humanity is Asia, yet the cradle of culture is Anatolia. Austrian linguist and historian Wilhelm Brandenstein presented a somewhat ambivalent paper on the origins of Etruscans, tracing them back to Central Asia, but stopping short of declaring ethno-racial relationships with ancient Turks. Hungarian historian Giza Feher talked about a Turco-Bulgarian tribe that founded the Bulgarian nation and contributed to European civilization in crucial ways. Another Hungarian scholar tracked Central Asian cultural influences into Hungary. Austrian prehistory professor Oswald Mengen examined the Anatolian cultural influence on Europe and ended his paper by calling the ancient inhabitants of Anatolia the people whose blood still circulates in the veins of contemporary Turks. Some participants used a general history perspective to offer praising accounts of New Turkey. Another group of non local participants at the conference, the emigre scholars, were in a tighter spot than other visitors. By 1937, when the Congress took place, the university reform that had started 4 years ago was a full fledged development. The Ottoman institution, the Dar Fonum, was replaced by a more regime friendly university. A large number of refugee scholars who were fleeing from Nazi horrors were employed in Turkey. The expectations to affirm the new Turco-centric scholarly theories were even greater for these refugees. In a short speech at the beginning of the Congress on behalf of the professors at the Faculty of Language and History, Geography in Ankara and the Faculty of Arts in Istanbul, Muzaffer Golker clearly indicated the direction for the professors by insisting that the foundation stones of the faculty in Ankara were the Turkish historical thesis and Turkish Sun language theory. A few examples should suffice to show how the emigre scholars responded to this call. German archaeologist Benno Landsberger, a professor of Assyriology at the faculty in Ankara, provided important arguments for the historical continuities between Republican Turkey and ancient Anatolian civilizations. His presentation focused on the mental and cultural aspects of anthropological research relating culture to racial continuities in history. The notion of race does not only assert the continuity that comes from the most distant times to the present day. Additionally, it also attempts to acquire knowledge about the unity of body and mind by the method of corresponding mental characteristics to a certain bodily type. Once again, white European scientists at the time saying race and a person's characteristics and mental acuity are tied one and the same. When we know for a fact this is not true. This is not true because Simon is black as hell and I'm smart as hell. Another emigre professor in Ankara sorry, another emigre professor in Ankara, Hans Henning von der Osten, delivered a paper that connected the Hittites to Central Asia. Hans Gustav Gotterbach, a Hittology professor in Ankara, gave a paper examining the Hittite practice of keeping historical records. Thus, both praising the Republican government and citing the Hittites as the predecessors of modern Turkey, philologist George Rode and Indologist Walter Rubin, both of whom taught in Ankara, contributed to anthropometric connections in their areas of expertise. Rode linked Anatolian sacred figures to the Romans, whereas Rubin traced metalworking in India to Central Asia. Ernst von Oster, a professor of philosophy in Istanbul, presented a highly acclaimed paper on Turks in the history of philosophy. Archaeologist and art historian Helmuth Theodor Bossert, defended the view that the printing press was invented by the Uyghur Turks before the Chinese and then was imported to Europe. The brief expose of the emigres in the Second Congress only scratches the surface of a rich and complex interaction between local and visiting scholars. Emigre scholars constituted a significant part of the scholarly mobilization in the 1930s. The regime saw them as the embodiment of Western science and civilization, although they were fleeing the ravages of the same modernity in Europe. We now turn to emigre scholars in the next chapter. So that's the end of chapter 4. Very interesting chapter. So this puts to bed any notion for people that say, oh, the Turks never dealt in race science, the Turks never thought about race or racism and stuff like that. These people were pulling out skulls. These people were having conferences where they were measuring their brain size. These people were measuring their noses and saying, we are Europeans. And the Turks have always been Europeans. And they were creating whole new narratives of history to back up this idea that they were the original Europeans and that they were white. Okay? So kill all of that. Anybody who's going to go forward and say the Turks in Turkey, we don't think about race. You're all of the Republican reformers, all of the people that built the modern Turkey, we're thinking about race constantly. All right. So IDK says my internet is so bad it cuts every second, but it's so awesome to hear you reading. If my professors would read like that, I would have an A++. Thank you, IDK, for the compliment. I appreciate you, IDK. I'm gonna send you some hearts. I'm gonna send some hearts your way, my bro. Send hearts to you. Thank you for the compliment. That's very nice of you to say. My hope is to be a professor one day. I want to be an educator. I want to be a more learned man because I'm ignorant right now. We all have to learn. We all have to grow. And I'm using this opportunity on my live stream channel not to BS, not to just talk about whatever is happening in pop culture with what rapper or this. I'm using this time to read books with y'all. and actually educate myself and educate the world at the same time. And hopefully, after I finish my studies in university here in Hungary or wherever I end up studying, I'll eventually get my PhD, be a sociology professor, writing my own books, having my own classroom, having my own students, and then doing all this big talk with y'all. Y'all, I want y'all to be along with the ride with me. See me grow, see me intellectually develop, support this channel because YouTube is trying to take my channel down. Because I keep it real, I keep it black, I keep it raw on this channel. I don't bite my tongue for nobody. And I'm committed. I'm committed to being a black excellent scholar. And I hope you will too. Whatever you want to do in your life, chase your dreams, work hard for it, and continue learning, right? That's what I got to say here. So IDK says, yes, I would be there to the end. Thank you, IDK. Shout out everybody else as well. And yeah, I want to continue reading. I'm going to continue reading. So once again, if you're bored, or if you're tired of hearing me read, just check back after the live stream, listen on 2X, or buy the book yourself. Buy the book yourself, Is the Turk a White Man, and read it for yourself. Let me take a quick water break. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, baby. Yes, indeed. Hold up. Now, I really like doing polls, so I'm going to set up a poll right now on this channel because for some reason I'm addicted to doing polls. I like doing polls on this channel. Let me see if I can set that up real quick. I want to continue reading. Y'all just bear with me. But if you have any questions or comments, y'all let me know. Jump in the live chat. IDK says, I was here when you were talking about Drake and Kendrick drama like the live before. Yeah, we might do another live talking about Drake and Kendrick and all that stuff because it is still interesting. It is relevant to hip hop culture and all that sort of stuff. I would like to do that, okay? I would like to continue doing that. All right. So, yeah, I don't know about a Q&A, but I will do a poll. I will do a poll. All right? All right. Da, da, da, da, da. Let's see. I'm going to ask this question. All right. All right. Are Turkish people whites? Let's just do a basic poll. Let's see if that gets some people in here. I'm going to start that poll and see how that goes. All right. So, IDK says, it's okay. We feel you. All right. All right. No worries. No worries. I would like to know what people think. Y'all jump into the live chat. Y'all leave that poll up there and let me know what you think. Okay. And yeah, Avery says, I voted. Okay. I didn't even know who's listening. I don't know who's listening. Y'all just be silently listening. I like that though. All right. IDK says, what do you think? Are they white? My thing is like whiteness, once again, is not real. And I believe if you are to participate in race as a social construct, it's about presentation and reception, similar to gender. This is a point where it's going to make a lot of people mad, like my right wing audience, right? Somebody wears a dress, has a padded bra, speaks in a higher tone of voice, and has long hair. Most of us would look at that and say, that's a woman. We don't know what's dangling between his or her legs or whatever pronouns they use, but the presentation and reception that that person will receive will be as a woman. Race is no different in my book because Turkish people, a lot of Turkish people, have lighter skin and they can present and show themselves as white, right? What we consider to be white in the Western world. Now, once again, race is a social construct that varies in different places. So, what is considered white in one place might not be considered others. And for example, a Turkish person might present as white, but when people find out their country of origin, or if they find out that they're Muslim, or if they find out that they speak another language, or they have a funny last name, they might not be considered white, right, anymore. Once again, it depends on the context. In America, I think by and large, Turkish people will be viewed as white, even if they are Muslim, even if they are have funny last names or something like that. That's what I think. That's my opinion on that. But it's more than just the presentation and the act of race, the performance of race, if you will. My thing is this: the Turks are white because they participated in white racial science at the time. They were measuring skull sizes, measuring noses, measuring cheekbones, creating up pseudo history, denigrating other groups of people, other races of people, to say that they were an elevated people, to then say that they were closer to whiteness, right? That's the thing. So that's my answer. That's my answer on our Turkish people whites. And right now the poll is split 50-50. Yes and no. Yes and no. Y'all keep on adding on to that. I'm going to keep on reading and I'll keep on answering any comments here. But let's jump into chapter 5. Close encounters and racial discourses, intellectual exchange and historical contingency. Two historical turning points in the year 1933 created the foundation for peculiar intellectual encounters under unexpected conditions. On one hand, when the Nazis seized power in Germany, many German scholars known to be Jewish or socialists left the country for fear of persecution. Main destinations for these scholars were the occupied capitals of Europe, especially London, Palestine. Sorry, many destinations for these scholars were the unoccupied capitals of Europe, especially London, Palestine, Latin America, especially Brazil, Mexico, and Peru, and the United States. For those displaced scholars who were seeking employment in Europe, a society called that in German, I refuse to read that, was founded in Zurich in the spring of 1933 under the leadership of the medical doctor Philip Schwartz. The year 1933 also witnessed a major effort in Turkey to reorganize higher education. The Turkish Republic at the time was undertaking preparations to commemorate its 10th anniversary, and the ruling reformers seemed intent on dismantling the old university system in which they viewed as the ideological gatekeeper of the Ottoman imperial order. Following the elimination of all opposition in the Turkish parliament in the second half of the 1920s, the government had introduced a major reforms in education immediately. However, the greatest confrontation with the Ottoman past materialized with the plans to reform the Darul Funun, literally the House of Knowledge, the Ottoman institution of higher education established in permanent form in 1900. Until 1933, a major obstacle to instituting a university friendlier to the new secular regime was the lack of academic personnel. In the summer months of 1933, just a few months before the beginning of a new academic year, the Turkish reformers were desperately looking for a way to overhaul the university system. Hitler gave them the perfect opportunity. So let's make this clear. This is very similar to what we're seeing in America now, where many of the people on the right are attacking institutions and universities, saying that the woke institutions are turning our kids into communists and socialists. And while we can only hope that is such, this is the attack that they're levying against our universities, which is why now we're seeing many people on the right saying, let's ban DEI, let's ban critical race theory, let's ban certain books and that sort of stuff. What we're seeing in America, anytime people want to try to rule over society, the first thing that they have to do is try to rewrite history and re-educate the people. And so attacking the university or reformulating the university to fit the narrative that you want is an important part of any sort of government or any sort of society or new regime that comes into power, right? Continuing here. The university reform and the role of emigre scholars strikes a sensitive chord. Sorry, one thing. Okay, sorry. The university reform and the role of emigre scholars strikes a sensitive chord in public memory. The majority of scholarly and popular accounts of the period presents a glorifying picture, according to which the Turkish government extends its helping hand to a persecuted minority for humanitarian reasons, usually based on grateful accounts of emigre memoirs translated into Turkish. For three important memoirs, see Hirsch, Newmark, and Schwartz. Glorifying accounts in both government and academic circles tend to present the flow of emigre scholars in 1933 as a historical continuation of the Ottoman practice of providing a safe haven to Sephardic Jews escaping from the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century. This narrative predominantly cites historians, sorry, this narrative predominantly cites humanitarian reasons and Turkish hospitality, as well as the pursuit of science and enlightenment. To explain the intellectual exchange in that period, however, a number of other publications paid more attention to the complex and difficult position of emigre scholars with regard to local concerns about modernization. In this chapter, I examine a significant wave of close individual and institutional exchanges that formed and was formed by the image of Western modernity in Turkey, focusing mainly on emigre scholars who were employed in universities after 1933, but also paying attention to some of the Western intellectuals and experts who visited Turkey during the early Republican era for various reasons. While this chapter situates the experiences and interactions of emigre scholars in the context of Turkey's modernization, a central goal is to take the discussion further by linking the modernity to an immense scholarly mobilization for the purpose of establishing historical, linguistic, and racial essences of Turks. Emigre scholars were instrumental in the Turkish reformers' project of importing a universal science to address local concerns. The arguments will revolve around the social sciences and humanities because they were the main targets of the government efforts to manufacture an authentic modernity on par with the West. Many areas of study that are considered distinct today, such as folklore, archaeology, anthropology, museum studies, philology, history, ethnography, and prehistory, showed considerable overlap then. I will treat the social sciences and humanities in their entirety, without paying particular attention to the disciplinary boundaries of the period. The employment of emigre scholars in Turkey marks an important chapter of Turkey's more than 200-year-long history of modernization. Emigre scholars illustrate how Turkish modernization relied on the quote-unquote West, not only as an abstract and distant model, but also in the form of close encounters and interactions. As we saw in Chapter 4, the image of Western science operated as a mythical and distant object in the biometric and anthropometric mobilization of the period. The flow of ideas took place through translations of Western publication and fleeting encounters, such as conference attendances by scholars from Europe and North America. At the root of Turkey's perception of the West remains a difficult love hate relationship. The image of Europe as a model to be admired and imitated coexists with fears of intrusion and loss of an authentic identity. The story of emigre scholars in the 1930s encapsulates the complex dynamics of Turkish modernization in the context of intellectual exchange, seen as the representatives of a much yearned for Western civilization. These displaced scholars were incorporated into a multitude of efforts to establish the Turks' innate abilities to modernize. They also were subject to a fair share of public criticism, especially in cases when faced with unrealistic expectations to integrate into Turkish society or to support the government sponsored Turco-centric scholarship. Emigre scholars were given the difficult task of helping westernize the country while maintaining, in fact, adopting its rarely defined unique identity. So basically, what he's trying to say here is that, at that time, 1933, Nazis were coming to power. Europe was becoming fascist, once again, stuff like that. And basically what he's saying is that Turkey was inviting all of these European scholars to come here to help, modernize the country, help with the intellectual pursuits of their universities and stuff like that. But at the same time, be in support of the new creation of the new Turkish history, identity, and modernization as well, right? So, there's this love-hate relationship that the Turks have with the West, where they look at Europe as the model, but also at the same time look at it as something that needs to be feared or reviled. And so these emigre scholars are, being used to help bolster the idea about Turkishness as a race, the Turkish claims to prehistory, the Turkish claims to civilization building and all that stuff. And that's the point of what he's trying to say right here. All right. The project of modernization contained universalistic aspects that were intended to function for particular local needs. A body of racial, historical, and linguistic theories attempted to create and sustain a nationally homogeneous society while at the same time emphasizing the contributions of Turkishness to Western and modern history. Republican scholars tried to establish the Turkish origins of Western civilization with the help of Western social sciences in general and of Western emigre scholars in particular. In the process of facilitating the local efforts to import Western modernity into the specificity of Turkishness, refugee scholars encountered contradictory demands and employed different strategies to respond to these demands. The stories of Western scholars and experts in general, and emigre scholars in the social sciences and humanities in particular, resemble a microcosm of Turkey's vexed relations with Westernization. While Western scientists in the first half of the 20th century were diligently comparing, classifying, and analyzing differences between East and West, the seemingly passive subjects of these comparisons, the Eastern others, were seeking creative ways to turn these taxonomic practices to their advantage. Modernization efforts in Turkey involved a particularization of the universal when the modernizing elites adopted Western ideas and practices. Having served specific local goals, the particular was then universalized when the elites offered the outcome of this combination to the world as a gift of Turkish creativity and essential abilities. The university itself was expected to pursue a science that was to be learned from the West, yet recovered from a prelapsarian past. Prelapsarian, we looked this word up. This basically means during the time of Adam and Eve. The scholarly mobilization of the period, with its incessant search for the Turks' historical, linguistic, and ethno-racial roots, built on a perception of modernity as an inherent ability passed on through timeless historical links. The emigre scholars in the social sciences and humanities in early Republican Turkey served an important purpose. They provided a reliable body of scholars who acted not only as generators of modernization and producers of Western knowledge through their teaching and research in universities, but also as excavators of an indigenized science and scholarship that would pass on to and be reproduced by future generations of Turkish scholars. Although some were troubled by the paradoxes generated in the process, for the Republican elite, there was no contradiction between the goal of attaining Western modernity with the help of Western scholars, fleeing from the ravages of modernity and using this modernity for more local ideological goals of the regime. Think about this. Think about how crazy that is. Think about this. The Jews and many other Europeans were fleeing Europe because the modernity that the Europeans had turned genocidal. The Europeans were starting to eat themselves after they had decided to eat the rest of the world. After committing genocides in Latin America, committing genocides in New Zealand, Australia, and throughout Asia as well, during the era of colonialization, now the Europeans turned on themselves. The fascists had come to power, and they were threatening to have the final solution for the Jews, final solution for the gypsies, final solutions for any ethnic group seen as inferior to the folk of whoever was proclaiming such a thing. And so the Turks see this and say, you know what we need? We need more European scholars to make us more modern. Think about how perverse that is. Think about how perverse white supremacy is. We see white folks eating themselves, killing themselves, and we say, give us more. How can we be like you? Because you have trams that run through Vienna, because you built subways in Budapest, we need to be like y'all, even though all of your ideologies, when taken to their furthest extent, lead to fascism, genocide, and horrific crimes against humanity. Think about that. Think about that. Too many people, I said this in my previous live stream before, too many people identify with their oppressors. Too many people still look at European civilization as being something that needs to be modeled and looked after and tried and replicated, even when the most heinous things that have happened in history have come from the minds and ideas that the Europeans have put forth in the sense of chasing modernity. Think about that. That's crazy. That's literally perverse. That's crazy and perverse. All right, continuing here. So, despite the variations in the goals, status, and experiences of Western scholars and experts in Turkey, they had to negotiate with the image of the West that was to be both revered and scorned at the same time. The views of Western scholars and experts mattered to a great degree, since the Republican reformers considered the Western opinion the ultimate target audience for witnessing the success of the Turkish modernization. For this reason, regardless of their degree of participation in the elite's scholarly mobilization, even the mere presence of emigre scholars lent credence to the discovery and legitimation of Turkishness, even without the coincidence of 1933, which made the university reform and the employment of emigre scholars possible. Historical, linguistic, and racial claims in the search of Turkish essences required support from Western scientific discourse, both in order to attach itself to the project of modernity and in order to construct a sense of modernity as an indigenous invention. Interesting. Continuing here, the university reform and emigre scholars. The persecution of scholars in Nazi Germany and the Turkish attempts to reform the university might have ended up as two unrelated, perhaps diametrically opposite episodes of modernity. Western scholars fleeing the ravages of modernity gone wrong, and a nation state established on an Islamic imperial heritage, claiming in vain its share of that modernity. Albert Malch, a Swiss professor of pedagogy, brought these distant developments together and started a wave of intellectual exchange that would continue for decades. Upon the Turkish government's invitation, Malch visited Turkey as an expert in higher education in 1932 and offered his report after 4 months of investigations. Malach's arrival in Turkey created intense speculation as to the fate of the professors at the Darul Fanoon. Even as late as in May 1933, the nature of the reform was not clear. For example, an article in the semi official daily Cumhuriyet entitled, "What Does Professor Malach Want?" argued that Malach found all Turkish professors in Istanbul as competent as their counterparts in Europe. This, according to the article, proved that earlier claims and rumors were unfounded. In fact, Ataturk visited the Darul Funun on July 3rd, 1933, and reportedly said that the institution is good, but it is necessary to work harder. Yet Malach's report was not quite as placid. In his report, Malach connected the university to a larger process of modernization, giving a detailed account of various problems associated with the old institution and suggesting a sweeping overhaul. Moreover, the report did not consider the autonomy of the university a necessity, thus placing the suggested reforms entirely within the purview of the government. The report appears to be largely rephrasing some of the prevalent criticisms of the period. Coming from a foreign expert, however, Malach's criticisms seem to have provided legitimacy for government interference with the university. When Malach heard about the Society for Displaced German Scholars in Zurich, he immediately contacted Schwartz about the planned university reform in Istanbul and invited him to visit Ankara at the end of May 1933. In his memoirs, Schwartz points out that by then, I'm not going to read that. The German school had an established reputation among the displaced scholars precisely because of German government's negative publicity. Considering the time pressure, the new university was scheduled to open on August 1st, and the high demand for Western professors, at least 30 to 40 were requested by the Turkish government. Schwartz ominously declared that a miracle was expected from him. But the meeting was satisfactory for both parties. In his telegram to the headquarters of the society, he did not suppress his sense of exhilaration about finding jobs for not 3, but exactly 30. The first protocol, signed between the Turkish government and the German school on July 6, 1933, resulted in the hiring of 58 German scholars. So think about this, man. At this time, Nazi Germany, things are going down, and Turkey is inviting possible Nazi scholars to come to Turkey. Okay, okay. Continuing here. Malach's emphasis on a complete overhaul under state tutelage must have sounded attractive to the government, especially considering the reformers' inclination toward positivist elitism. Criticism against the Darul Fanoon in the early 1930s indicates that the reformers pictured the university as an ideological tool of modernizing reforms that should not claim even the slightest pretense to impartiality. When the racial, linguistic, and historical thesis of the Republican elite were slowly forming in the early 1930s, the modernizers complained about the Darul neutrality toward them. Neutrality was equated with opposition. One of the radical critics of the old institution, Ismail Hushrev Tokin, maintained those institutions and individuals of society that stay outside of or impartial to the reforms are only negative institutions and individuals. The impartial party or institution would support fundamentalism knowingly or unknowingly, especially if this institution is a university. Another major critique against the old institution had to do with the Republican elite's never ending suspicions towards the Ottoman past. For many among the ruling elite, even the most reformed Darul could not cease being a center of religious fundamentalism because of its ties to the Ottoman past. The differences between the old and the new were constructed categorically following the taxonomic logic of modernizers. A columnist in the daily Hakimiyet Emilie, for example, argued that the Ottoman and Republican Darfanoons could not resemble each other neither in spirit nor in appearance. One of the leading authors and Republican parliamentarians of the period, Haki Tariq, was defending the abolition of the Darfanoon and employment of Western scholars as early as in 1931. In fact, despite the absence of outright and official attempts, it is possible to conclude that the abolition must have been set as a desirable goal much earlier than 1933. So once again, the irony, and the coincidences of everything, the paradoxes of everything, are just converging on top of each other, overlapping on one thing. On one hand, the Ottoman, no, not the Ottomans, these new Turkish Republicans who are seeking to create a new Turkish identity, new Turkish nationality, new Turkishness for this new nation that they're creating in the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. They're saying, on one hand, the Turks were a proud civilization building race. They have always had modernity in their hearts and spirits, and the Turks were involved in all of the greatest civilizations being built. And this new modernity that's being crafted right now comes from us deep down inside. But at the same time, they're seeking to get rid of one of their oldest educational institutions by firing the teachers who are there and staffing it full of German intellectuals during the time of the Nazi regime. Make it make sense. Like, somebody make it make sense to me. It seems like they had a real sort of conflict right there. But the paradoxes of race, the paradoxes of whiteness, the paradoxes of this racial construct that we are living under right now are never apparent to people who are playing along with it. Is what I'm getting from this. It's what I'm getting from this. It makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me that on one hand the Turks were saying we have we have a history of civilization building, and at the same time let's get rid of our institutions of our most learned men at the time and staff them full of possibly Nazi German intellectuals. I'm so confused. I'm so confused. Okay, the Republican elites considered the university reform in 1933 as a continuation of the establishment of two official societies for the study of history and language. Considering that the architect of the reform, the Minister of Education, Reşit Galip, served as the General Secretary of the Turkish Historical Society before his ministerial appointment, the university must have been considered an integral part of the racial, historical, and linguistic mobilization of the period. In fact, the Darülfünun's disappointing performance in the first Congress of History put the final nail in his coffin. As one of the young intellectuals of the period, Burhan Asef Belge, commented in the journal Kadro, a man will see with grief if he is a Turk and with surprise if he is not, what a pathetic result the Darülfünun had in the first Congress of History. We only need to remember some of the debates in the first historical Congress and Reşit Galip's blow to a Darülfünun professor. I am very thankful for not being a student in front of Zeki Validi's lectern at the Darülfünun to gauge the prevailing attitude. Not surprisingly, a major complaint about the institution was its indifference toward the reforms. The establishment of the Faculty of Language and History in Ankara in 1935 also signals the links between the Republican anthropometric project and the academic establishment. In her memoirs, Ataturk's adopted daughter and one of the influential ideologues of the period, Afet İnan, directly connects the opening of the faculty to the first Congress of History, arguing that history and geography were the most important disciplines in the Congress, and that the following 3 points were significant. 1. Investigating the main sources of Turkish history. 2. Obtaining new knowledge with the help of archaeology. 3. Demonstrating racial characteristics in history and present times with the help of anthropological methods. The coupling of history and geography in the new faculty illustrates a predominant notion in the period that history without the guidance of maps would be useless. The emphasis on language in the faculty referred to two related projects. One was the teaching and studying of all ancient languages that would serve as a source to the history of Turks and Turkey. For this reason, Inan explains, in addition to Chinese and Sinology, Indology, Sumerology, Hittitology, Hungarology, that were related to Central Asian Turkish history, Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Persian chairs took place in the programs of faculty's establishment. The second project was the examination and development of the Turkish language. So basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to take the education, the educational institution, which is one of the oldest, or most prestigious universities there, or houses of learning in Turkey, and basically turn it into a propaganda mill. How can we find out the origins of Turkish people, knowledge of how Turkish people came to be, and how Turkish people invented the sun, moon, and stars? That's basically what they're trying to turn it into. Very, very interesting here. Very interesting. And yeah, this is very white behavior. This is very white behavior. This is the whitest of white behavior. All right. IDK says the internet is killing me. I hope you can tune in. I hope my internet connection is not that bad. Yeah, y'all let me know if it's my connection, if it's chopping up. But yeah, once again, watch this on the playback. Watch this on the playback. It's probably great. So, the architect of the university reform, Rechet Gallup, was appointed as the Minister of Education specifically to undertake the overhaul in September 1932. After a tenure of 10 months, he was forced to resign on August 13th, 1933, just a couple of weeks after the completion of the reform. As reported in the Daily Cumhuriyet, on the day of the new university's opening ceremony, the Minister of Education did not fail to mention the Turkish modernizers' disappointment with the Darülfünun as one of the reasons for a new university. Great political and social reforms took place in the country. The Darülfünun remained a neutral observer of these. Fundamental deeds took place in the economic realm. The Darülfünun appeared ignorant of them. Radical changes occurred in law. The Darülfünun appeared ignorant of them. The script reform occurred. The movement for the purification of language started. The Darülfünun did not care. A new vision of history engulfed the entire country in a national movement. It took 3 years of effort and waiting to create an interest in the Darülfünun. The Turkish reformers considered the old university a poor fit, especially for the cultural mobilization in the 1930s to search for the historical, linguistic, and racial roots of the Turks. Behind these rising accusations, there certainly lies the distrust toward an institution that represented existing links with the Ottoman past. Despite clear historical continuities between the Ottoman and Republican periods, modernizers relied on categorical distinctions between the old and the new, as well as on the rejection of the former. Therefore, for some adamant modernizers, even the most reformed Darülfünun could not cease being a center of religious fundamentalism because of its ties to the past. Closing the Ottoman University symbolized the regime's goal to settle the accounts with the ancien regime. Although the criticism against the old university was building steadily in the 1930s, judging from the tone of the media coverage, the hopes for a major reorganization seemed dim. In fact, the Minister of Education, Rechet Gallup, officially denied intentions to overhaul the university as of as late as in October of 1932. Reforming education in general, and higher education in particular, was not a uniquely Republican project. Ottoman modernization, too, took education reform seriously. In fact, the Ottomans tried to reform the Darülfünun even during the trying days of World War I between 1915 and 1918. A small number of scholars from Germany were hired to teach at the Ottoman capital. The reform did not involve an institutional restructuring, but relied on inviting German scholars for a number of teaching positions. Upon the request of the Ottoman government, 20, 20 German professors accepted teaching posts at the Darülfünun. Professors' areas of expertise varied from sciences to humanities, but the inclusion of experts in disciplines such as Ural-Altaic languages and archaeology were one of the signals for the rising interest in Turkishness in the late Ottoman period. The Darülfünun survived the regime change in 1923 as an Ottoman institution of higher education, trying to adapt to the ideological terrain of the Republican government. The pre 1933 reforms in higher education were limited in scope. A faculty of law was established in 1927 in Ankara, followed by a high institute of agriculture in 1933. The institute, originally opened as an agricultural high school in 1930, was established by a German economist. Initially, teaching at the institute was done only by more than 20 German professors, but by 1942, all of them had left Turkey. After the reform, a multitude of faculties was also established as separate entities in Ankara after the reform in Istanbul. The Faculty of Language and History Geography in 1935, the Faculty of Political Sciences in 1938, the Faculty of Science in 1940, and the Faculty of Medicine in 1945. All of these separate faculties later combined under the institutional structure of the University of Ankara, opened in 1946. In Istanbul, a technical institute was converted into the Technical University in 1944. However, the extent of the overhaul in 1933 was unprecedented when compared to other, more technically oriented scholarly exchanges. The first meeting in Ankara between Schwartz, Malch, and the representatives of the Turkish government led to other meetings and started a wave of German and Austrian scholars seeking refuge in Turkey, as well as a small number from other countries, such as Switzerland, Britain, France, and Italy. The first protocol signed between the representatives of the Turkish government and of the German school on July 6, 1933, resulted in the hiring of 58 German, mostly Jewish scholars. Okay, so they weren't probably Nazis. because they were probably Jewish. Continuing here. Although the exact number of scholars and their family members in Istanbul and Ankara constantly fluctuated with new additions, deaths, resignations, and dismissals, the magnitude of the numbers is a testament to the extent of the reform. When the University of Istanbul opened in 1933, 42 out of a total of 180 faculty members consisted of emigre scholars. More strikingly, 38 out of a total of 64 senior professors who held chairs at the university consisted of refugees. Very interesting. But once again, how did these guys teach? Because I doubt these guys learned Turkish. And, generally, Turkish people don't know German or any of these other European languages, right? So, how did they actually communicate with people? Did they have a translator in class? Makes no sense. Continuing here. It seems that the government was ready to sacrifice financially in order to attract experienced professors who were intended to train a generation of Turkish scholars. In his memoirs, legal scholar Ernst Hirsch, for example, remarks how he declined an offer from the University of Amsterdam because conditions in Turkey were better than good. Turkey's closeness to Europe and proximity also must have played a role for its relative desirability for European exiles. After finding out his acceptance at the university, physicist Harry Dember wrote in a letter in 1935, "It is certainly right on the edge. You can see across to Asia, but it is still in Europe. The local scholars did not fare so well." After the reform of 157 After the reform, 157 Turkish faculty members employed at the old university were dismissed. The parliament, in its meeting on May 31st, 1933, accepted a bill proposing the abolition of the Darülfünun on July 31st, 1933, and the establishment of the University of Istanbul on August 1st, 1933. The university the process leading to the abolition of the Darülfünun and the establishment of the new university engaged the public opinion. All right, sorry, my phone is acting up. So, the process leading to the abolition of the Darülfünun and the establishment of the new university engaged the public opinion. Major newspapers devoted a large part of their front pages to the news reporting the opening of the new university. Emigre scholars had to invoke the well-known and still prevalent rhetorical expectation if they wanted to garner local sympathy, falling in love with Turkey and Turks at first sight. An article in the semi-official daily Cumhuriyet enthusiastically reporting the affection of Western professors upon their arrival in Turkey is a case in point. The article saw it's appropriate the article saw it appropriate to subsume individual voices under the category of the foreign professor. The fact that no individual names were mentioned and that the narrative perfectly follows the rhetorical expectations of the local elite signals that the interview with professors may be fabricated. Some of the foreign professors who were interviewed yesterday by one of our correspondents at the university told him the following: "Most of us came to Turkey for the first time. We identified with the Turks very quickly, and we liked Turkey as our own homeland. We were following the Great Reform here while we were in Germany anyway." This was said by an anonymous scholar. IDK says, "Simon, so I'm sorry, but I have to go to the store with my family. When I come back home, I'm going to jump on your live. Bye, man." Shout out to IDK. Shout out to everybody tuning into the live stream. Listen, tune in, tune out as you need be, as need be. I'm not trying to hold anybody hostage here. If you come in here, you want to learn. You're coming in here, you want to be a part of this. If you're coming in here, you're interested in the topic. And if you have your own book that you suggest that we read for Book React, send it my way. Put it in the comments. Let me know what I should be reading. Anyway, this is very funny. Very funny that, all these scholars were coming to Turkey and Turks were like, very happy that they were firing their own teachers, closing their own, historical institutions of higher learning just to then, give jobs to white folks from Germany. And then to pat themselves on the back once again, to give themselves more legitimacy for this new regime and new social cultural revolution that they were putting in place. They were saying that, see, look, the white people like us, so this has to be right. This has to be right. We have to be modern because the white folks are coming to Turkey and they're saying, hey, it's great, it's fabulous, it's fantastic. Anyway, sorry. Continuing here. All right. The subterranean message in these is the figure of a Westerner who becomes acquainted with the quote unquote real Turk and sees through Western injustices and misrepresentations. Despite some variations, most of the hiring contracts of emigres covered a span of 5 years, with the stipulation that they could be extended if both parties agreed. Professors were allowed to lecture in French, German, or English for 3 years after. At the end of this period, they were required to have mastered the Turkish language sufficiently to be able to teach and publish in Turkish. In practice, only a few professors, Ernst Hirsch, Fritz Ernst, and Fritz Neumann, Hans Gustav Gutterbach, and Benno Landsberger, among others, were able to meet the language requirement. Hirsch demonstrated his enthusiasm by having his first lecture translated from German into Turkish and then reciting the Turkish text in classroom. The Turkish media received Hirsch's gesture favorably. His lecture made it to the first page of the semi-official daily Cumhuriyet. After commending Hirsch's efforts, the article maintained the majority of the foreign professors say that they would learn Turkish in less than 6 months and that they have been taking language lessons from the assistants. Despite the premature enthusiasm of the press, the lectures continued to be conducted in other languages after the 3 year period. In many cases, a teaching assistant was present in class to translate simultaneously, sentence by sentence. Since it was difficult to find English and German speaking assistants, most professors chose to lecture in the dominant language of the period, French. Refugee scholars' apparent difficulty and lack of enthusiasm to learn Turkish later turned the tide against them in the media. Emigres faced a number of other additional expectations. They were required to teach graduate level courses and prepare textbooks in Turkish for all their courses at the end of 3 years. Wow. Okay, maybe I don't want to be a professor if that's hard. It's that hard. Damn. Okay, the emigre scholars were also expected to contribute to the enlightenment of the general public with their educational activities. In addition, the scholars, when necessary, were required to provide their services to the government as experts. The subtle but enthusiastic rush to almost squeeze knowledge out of the emigre scholars and inject it to different segments of Turkish society hints at the fact that the government expected a quick period of transition which would be sufficient to absorb what the scholars had to offer and pass their duties on to local scholars. The Western scholars represented the missing links in the Dar al-Funun, a reliable body of scholars who acted not only as agents of modernization and producers of Western knowledge, but also as generators of an indigenized, Turkified science and scholarship that will pass on to and be reproduced future generations of scholars. Afet Inan illustrates this position in her memoirs when discussing the significance of the new faculty of language, history, and geography in Ankara, insisting that a humanitarian military mentality insisting that a humanitarian mentality governed these projects. Inan skillfully connected Western modernity with native goals. On one hand, the modern was being integrated into racial and national projects. On the other hand, local efforts were presented as service to the entire humanity. Hence, it was possible to provide a service to the world civilization and shedding light into the dark spots in Turkish history. At the same time, the insistence of the humanitarian nature of anthropometric goals survived for a long time in Turkish academia. An article published by the Turkish Historical Society, for example, asserts that Turkish historical thesis invited all people to unity by stressing a search for commonalities in the cultural legacy of humanity, and showed the importance that Ataturk attached to the ideal of humanity and love of humans. For the Republican elite, there was no contradiction between the two goals of attaining Western modernity with the help of emigre scholars and using this modernity for more local ideological goals of the Republic, because the university itself was expected to serve an ideological tool. According to Reshid Gallup, the most important characteristic of the new university is its national characteristic and reformism. The new university will forge the ideology of Turkish reform. Because of intense government intervention in university affairs, Neşet Omer Erdalp, the first rector of the Reform University, resigned in a year. Cemil Bilsel, his replacement between 1934 and 1943, believed that the links between the university and the regime were a necessity in periods of reform. In principle, in reformist countries like us, there cannot be a separation between the thinking of the reformist government and the university. The university, which is a superior achievement of the reform, is nothing but an organ of the reform. Once again, I think we could all agree that education should be beyond politics. It should be beyond whatever is happening in culture and society. And education should be as objective as possible, especially in the humanities, especially in parts of history and that sort of stuff. The government should not be having a say in what is being taught, heavily trying to influence how people are being taught and what messages are being put out there. Education should be unbiased and unvarnished by the hands of politics. That's what I would say. Continuing here. The Minister of Education, Rashid Ghalib, shared these views. In a country of radical reform, there would not be any tolerance toward an institution that stood so far away from the progression of the reform. The tension between national and international resurfaced as the Republican elite tried to come to terms with adapting Western science for local purposes. Ensuring the national usefulness of scientific endeavors at the university required the constant watchful eyes of the state. In order to maintain the ties between the university and the regime and to institute the student body with a sense of ideological commitment to the regime, the Institute of Turkish Reform was established as part of the Faculty of Arts in 1934. The news story covering the institute in the daily Cumhuriyet applauded the decision and described the lack of such an institute as the biggest imperfection of the regime. All registered students had to take courses from the institute in order to graduate. Even today, all university students take mandatory courses on the history of modernizing reforms and Turkish language, regardless of their majors. Although this chapter pays more attention to emigre scholars who had a disproportionate influence on Republican modernization, we need to acknowledge that not all visitors were refugees working in academic institutions. Adding experts to the category of visitors suggests a more complicated picture of interactions that, in fact, started earlier than the university reform. Experts were invited to Turkey to suggest solutions for specific problems. Among the refugees, some acted as experts in various government offices, such as ministries. However, a different group of foreign experts working under different conditions also existed. They were invited by the government specifically for investigating a certain institution or issue and write a report with corrective suggestions. Albert Malch, whose report on the Darfanoon led to radical changes in the institution of higher education, was one of these experts. Although experts' area of expertise varied significantly, education seems to be the government's central focus in seeking expert assistance. Perhaps the most famous and one of the earliest experts ever paid a visit to the Republican Turkey was the American pedagogue and philosopher John Dewey. Dewey's investigation of the educational system took 2 months in 1924 and resulted in two reports, a short one written while he was still in Turkey and a more detailed one produced and sent to the government after his return to the United States. Certain American principles among Dewey's suggestion, such as initiative and independence, ability to think scientifically, acquiring knowledge for pragmatic purposes, were readily embraced by the government, although it is hard to claim that Dewey's report had a major effect on the educational system. However, one can detect a shift in emphasis toward a more pragmatic perspective in the tone of educational policies. Dewey's pragmatism was certainly a good fit for the Republican modernizers' denunciation of ideology for the sake of practical action and progress. Pragmatically intended courses such as Knowledge for Life, which were introduced at the primary school level in order to give students knowledge in practical matters, can be traced back to Dewey's influence. Although Dewey's translated work on education might have influenced educational policies, however, Dewey's other American recommendations, such as the value of decentralization as opposed to uniformity in education, were ignored by the modernizers. Dewey cautioned the government. While Turkey needs unity in its educational system, it must be remembered that there is a great difference between unity and uniformity, and that a mechanical system of uniformity may be harmful to real unity. The central ministry should stand for unity, but against uniformity in favor of diversity. Only for diversification of materials can schools be adapted to local conditions and needs and the interest of different localities enlisted. Once again, I'm not surprised. American shows up in Turkey and brings his wicked culture. He's bringing crime, he's bringing drugs. John Dewey was trying to influence the Turks to be like us. And you know what? There's a lot of things that I actually like about the American education system and other things I don't. You get what I'm saying? I wish there was more emphasis on actual facts and actual logic and reasoning and stuff like that, because a lot of the times American education is based a lot on feelings and emotion and just rote memorization And there's of course a lot of like cultural propaganda put in there, like nationalism and stuff like that. So yeah, not surprised that the Turks wanted to incorporate. That's what John Dewey recommended. Once again, America and Turkey, we're like this, baby, we're like this. All right. Decentralization for the Republican educators must have sounded too much, as if going back to the Ottoman educational system. Several other Western educational experts focused on technical issues. Alfred Kuhn visited Turkey as a representative of German Ministry of Commerce and Industry and offered recommendations on vocational education. Similarly, the Belgian educational expert Omar Bouiche visited Turkey in 1927 and prepared a report on improving vocational and technical education. An American committee of experts embarked upon a broad investigation, focusing especially on the Turkish economy during 1933 and 1934. Part of the report also focused on education. The report mentioned Dewey's recommendations and repeated the need for a pragmatic orientation in education. Finally, American Beryl Parker, who had previously worked as a teacher in Ankara, was requested to examine the educational system. Parker's report emphasized the importance of education for economic development and offered suggestions mainly for primary schools. The issues that the government sought expert the issues that the government sought expert were not limited to education. Arts and architecture was another area of importance for the Republican elites. In music, perhaps the most famous visitor was Hungarian composer Bela Bartok. Laszlo Rassoni, a Hungarian professor of Turkology and philology at the University of Ankara, invited Bartok to Turkey in 1935 after they exchanged a series of letters. The official invitation went in 1936, and Bartok accepted to give 3 lectures on folk music, perform in 2 concerts, collect Turkish folk music, and organize discussions with the persons concerned about tasks for the future, all without a charge as long as his expenses for the trip was covered. After fulfilling his other promises, Bartok had only 9 days for his field work to collect folk songs in the Turkish countryside. In order to dispel the disadvantages of the presence of a foreigner and gain quick rapport with the peasants, his assistant in Turkey, Adnan Saygun, suggested telling peasants that Bartok was Hungarian and that the Hungarians were only Turks who had settled somewhere else, other than Anatolia. In order to convince them, Saygun and Bartok concocted a sentence that consisted of words common to both Turkish and Hungarian. Bartok uttered this sentence when he met peasants. The visitor's Hungarian background placed him in the middle of prevalent Turco-centric racial discourses of the period. After decades of scholarly mobilization, the belief in the existence of the ancient links between Turks and Hungarians was widespread among the Republican modernizers. In this sense, Bartok's visit complemented the efforts to produce racial and cultural taxonomies in which Turkishness would be defined with its reference to European origins. As an example of how the visit was framed, we can look at the introduction to Bartok's 3 lectures, which were published in book format in Turkish. Interesting. He, Bartok, recognizes himself as the child of an Asian people. The people have conserved the essence of their racial culture until today. In order to discover the treasure that would be the basis for national music, it is necessary to go down to the people, to work in the people, and to collect the structural material of a real national music. Bartok has done this and has found what he was seeking. Very interesting. On one hand, I appreciate, cultural exchanges. Bartok, famous Hungarian composer, gets invited to come to Turkey, perform his concerts, lecture on music, learn from the people there, and educate them as well. But his visit also had other implications because Bartok is coming from the West, even if you don't consider, Hungary a part of geographically Western Europe. It is culturally a part of the West, right? And it has close ties to all of those nations as well that we would consider the West. So, yeah, his visit to Turkey was also there to help bolster the claim that the Turks were closer to whites because, look, the Hungarians, they're whites, and they are an Asiatic language speaking people like us too, right? They're no different than us, and they try to use his visit there as a type of propaganda for their beliefs. So Craig Matt says, "What up, Simon? When I'm in Turkey, I always have to be on the street smarts because of their scamming." Yeah, there's a lot of scams out there in Turkey. A lot of scams out there in Turkey. You got to be careful, but they don't be scamming like them Tanzanians. They don't be scamming like go to Africa. You pay what you pay, nigga. You pay what you pay. All right, continuing here. Bartok tried to publish his ethno-musical collection of Turkish music after he immigrated to the United States, but his efforts proved unsuccessful. Despite the lack of national interest. The visit energized the local efforts to link folkloric studies with racial, linguistic, and historical essences. Fittingly, Bartok's messages were in tune with the anthropometric expectations. For example, in one lecture, Bartok asserted that the Asiatic Turks invented the pentatonic scale. He also insisted that the similarities between Hungarian and Turkish musical forms went beyond cultural exchange. It is self evident that all these types of melodies originated from a single source, and it appears that this source is an old northern center of Turkish musical culture. Since 1,000 years ago, in our music and language, and doubtlessly in other areas of civilization, there has been so much Turkification that, if I may say so, we have almost become half brothers. And let me add that because this Turkification did not occur without the important incidents of blood mixing, we Hungarians should be ancestrally closer to the Turk than to the Finno-Ugric people. This was said by Bartok. The government also invited architects, among them such as Paul Bonatz, were neither a Jew nor anti-Nazi. Among them, such as Paul Bonatz, were neither a Jew nor anti-Nazi. In fact, some consider Bonatz's architectural style proto-Nazi. His conservative and nationalistic architectural views appear to be a good fit with the autocratic regimes of the period. Architectural buildings that had to represent the rationality and functionalism of modernist movement to break free from the Oriental mentality in general and the Ottoman tradition in particular. Staying in Ankara from 1943 to 1957, Bonatz commanded respect among the Republican modernizers. His selection to the committee responsible for designing Ataturk's mausoleum is a good indication for this. Another architect, Bruno Tott, who fled Germany in 1936, had a longer list of credentials. Before his death in 1938, he designed the Faculty of Language, History, Geography, and perhaps most prestigiously, Ataturk's catafalque, used for the funeral in 1938. I'm very interested. What is a catafalque? I'm imagining a catafalque is like another, like a hearse or something. That is a very cool word, catafalque. What is a catafalque? A catafalque, a decorated wooden framework supporting the coffin of a distinguished person during a funeral while lying in state. I see. So this is a catafalque. A catafalque is like the supporting beam. It's the support beam that you put a very important person's casket on. Very interesting. Very cool word. Okay, learned a new word today. All right, continuing here. Before his death in 1938, he designed the Faculty of Language, History, Geography, and perhaps most prestigiously, Ataturk's catafalque, used for the funeral in 1938. Interesting. So the guy whose architectural style is sometimes called proto-Nazi designed the stand that supported Ataturk's funeral in 1938. Oh, wow. Okay. However, the government did not fully understand what he represented architecturally. For example, a 1936 brochure distributed to the students at the Academy of Fine Arts in Ankara indicated that Tott was invited to fight against bad cubic buildings that invaded the rural areas. Although Tott was a stout modernist, as guests offering specialized knowledge in intermittent visits, invited experts did not face some of the challenges experienced by the refugees. Western emigre scholars had to deal with the complex web of discourses and perceptions involving their status in the country: refugee, foreigner, Jew, government employee, expert, conference participant, or brief visitor, as well as the meaning of the quote-unquote West, Western science, modernity, and Turkishness. For the government in contemporary Turkey, it is all too tempting to connect the experiences of Jewish German scholars within a grand narrative of Turkish hospitality. Since the 1930s, the Turkish government has organized public events to commemorate the arrival of Sephardic Jews fleeing Spanish Inquisition in the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. Recent publications tell the story of Turkish officials during World War II saving the lives of persecuted Jews when European countries failed to offer any protection for fear of German reprisals. Although the Republican modernizers were enthusiastic to integrate Jewish German scholars into Turkey's higher educational system as respected professors, one should not neglect the ambiguous position of Jews of Turkey. While emigres were enjoying privileged positions, anti Semitism and Nazi sympathy were rising, especially during the war. Jewish citizens of Turkey were under the pressure of Turkification campaigns. What made the scholars relatively immune was the fact that they were welcomed as representatives of Europe and its modernity rather than as Jews. The architect of the university reform, Reşit Galip, illustrates this point in a speech to a number of emigre scholars. 500 years ago, when Constantinople was conquered, Byzantine scholars left the country. It was not possible to keep them here. Most of them went to Italy after Byzantium, and this initiated the Renaissance. Today, we are here to meet a reverse current from Europe. We hope that our nation will become wealthier and renewed. Bring us your knowledge and methods. Open the doors of progress for our youth. We promise you our gratitude and respect. I never want to hear somebody say the Jews aren't white. I never want to hear somebody say the Jews aren't white, because Turkey was inviting these European scholars during the time of Nazis, harnessing power in Europe, inviting these white scholars to Turkey, firing their own university scholars, their Turkish national scholars, putting them in place as representatives of Turkey's modernization, closeness to Europe, and the fact that white people were coming here to validate all the Turks' wild claims that they were the ancient Sumerians, that the Turks invented UFOs, the Turks discovered Atlantis, all this sort of stuff. Never want to hear this. Jewish people are white. Jewish people can be white, to be more exact. Anyway, continuing here. So, ambivalence dominated the approach toward the image of the West created during Republican modernization. The emigre scholars occupied a precarious position between the fascination with and fear of the West. Western scholars were foes because they represented a scientific tradition that historically relegated Turkey to the position of invariable otherness. They were also friends because claims of Republican scholarly mobilization had to garner the discursive support of scientific detachment. The emigre scholars were seen as incarnations of Western knowledge. The fascination gave especially the scholars in exile an unexpectedly high status as representatives of Western scientific knowledge. Although anti-Semitism existed in most of the world in that period, the exiles were external others for the Turkish government and public, not internal others, as was the case in Germany. In Turkish eyes, emigre scholars who saw themselves as victims of Western progress and modernity represented the very modernity from which they were fleeing. For the minister, emigres would rekindle a new renaissance in Turkey and bestow European modernity to its rightful owners in its own cradle. The university reform and emigre scholars epitomized Turkish reformers' struggle to employ science in their efforts to manufacture a positivist modernity with racial, historical, and linguistic links to the West. The exiles were Jews for the Nazis, but they were Europeans for the elite. They were European. That very Europeanness, however, made them a target of criticism as well, because the West in that period elicited feelings of suspicion and aversion in addition to those of admiration. Resentment toward the West, as it was perceived among the Turks, surfaced as intense criticism against Western scholars on many grounds. Regardless of whether they were exiles or not, the Turkish scholars of that period were feeling threatened by the newcomers, as many of them either lost their jobs or had to work for less money compared to a foreign professor's salary. Difficulties in mastering the Turkish language constituted a major problem. The government expected emigre scholars to help Turkish become a universal language of science and knowledge. Although some of the scientists helped Turkify scientific terminology, the Turkish press relentlessly criticized the professors, expecting a much shorter period of adaptation from them, especially as far as the language skills were concerned. This is the thing, man. Turkish is a hard ass language. And one of the most annoying things about people from Turkey, when you're not, speaking, when you're trying to speak their language, and this goes for a lot of other languages as well. Unlike English, people speak broken English all the time, and we don't laugh at them. People speak broken, distorted, effed up English, and nobody laughs or giggles or switches to another language to try to communicate with them. You get what I'm saying? In America, generally around the world, because English is such a global language, maybe that is the advantage. But the thing is, a lot of other languages say, how come more people don't speak Bosnian? How come more people don't speak Turkish? How come more people don't speak Armenian? But then when people try to speak their language, they just laugh and giggle at them at the store. And then on top of that, they then switch to English, right? I had that happen a lot when I was living in Serbia, trying to learn Serbian. And of course, because of the racism in Serbia, when I'm talking on the phone to them, saying, hey, come up with my food or whatever, and I'm saying it in broken Serbian, they're responding, okay, blah, blah, blah, blah, blah, in Serbian. Then when I open the door and they see my black ass, they're speaking to me in English. You get what I'm saying? That's not cool. That's not cool. That's not going to help people actually try to integrate into your society or learn your language or culture. You get what I'm saying? But maybe I'm just letting my trauma speak through me. But Turkish is a hard ass language. I'm not mad at the scientists at the time for not being able to learn it. Learning one of those languages is very hard. Turkish, Hungarian, any of those Altaic, Central Asian languages, hella hard. okay, in Turkey, also worked against the refugees. German efforts to draw Turkey into the war and strengthen among the Turkish government elite the widespread belief in an imminent German victory. As a result, the Turkish government laid off the majority of German Jewish experts working in government offices, and many refugees of Jewish origin or with socialist or communist leanings were deported on charges of spying. The law on foreign residence and travel in Turkey. Wow, enacted in 1938, made the acceptance of scholars into Turkey extremely difficult, further supporting the view that there were limits to welcome offered to Western scholars. The law's text specified race as a significant category of belonging, hence weakening legal protections for refugee scholars. Article 8, for example, stipulates that those who belong to the Turkish race in terms of origin could stay in Turkey for a year without paying a fee. Similarly, according to Article 23, deporting a foreign individual who belonged to the Turkish race requires a resolution by the cabinet, whereas other foreigners could be deported by the decision of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As much as one should accept that admitting refugee scholars into Turkey was a commendable act, the government's restrictive policy limited the refugee status only to those who would be useful for the regime. Other perceptions of modernity existed against the ascendancy of a hardliner group who emphasized using state power in their aggressive pursuit of a secularist, positivist, humanist agenda. The university reform marks increasing power of this group in education. It is no surprise that the transition from the old to the new university was rhetorically portrayed as an attempt to break the shackles of tradition and backwardness in the quest for science and enlightenment. In more concrete terms, one of the targets of the assault was a more conservative strain of Republican scholars, best represented by Ismail Haki Baltocikoglu. All these Turkish names, the first president of the Darülfünun in the Republican era. In formulating their criticism against positivism, Republican conservatives followed Henry Bergson's work and emphasized spiritualism, free will, and creativity. Jumping into the comments here, Craig Matt says, request video, have Acti make Beatty one day, and you make some shrimp and etouffee. Sure, Craig Mac, we'll work on that. We'll make some Turkish food, and I'll make some Louisiana food. We'll do that for you, buddy. Don't worry. Don't worry. We got more content coming for you. We got more easily digestible content coming for the people, because that's what we do. On Simon Hill Keeps It Trail. Continuing here, conservative scholars hope to push the regime away from the universalism of positivist evolutionism, although they had no objections to secularism and nationalism. Their contention that Republican modernity should refrain from severing its ties to a unique national tradition and the creativity of the Turkish nation was interpreted by the hardliners as obscurantism. The university reform provided an important opportunity to oust conservative Republicans from higher education. Their replacements in the social sciences and humanities were German emigres with positivist inclinations: Ernst Hirsch, Helmut Ritter, Ernst von Oster, Hans Ritkenbach, Clemens Bascht, Alexander Rustow, and William Peters. Therefore, the efforts to steer Turkish modernity toward a unique tradition took a serious blow with the new university. The search for Turkish essences in historical, linguistic, and racial studies, in which emigre scholars were to play an important role, offered useful tools to combine authenticity and modernity. Considering the nature of Turkish modernity and the way in which the images of the West and the East have been constructed, the conjunction of the plight of displaced Western scholars and the modernizing elite in need of a loyal university does not merely represent a historical coincidence. The rhetoric of coincidence has been frequently employed by proponents of the Republican regime, who at the heart of the university reform see a pragmatic and enlightened group of leaders taking advantage of an unexpected incident. While acknowledging the opportunism involved in the university reform lets us appreciate the significance of contingency in the unfolding of history, it is also important to note that the coincidence in this case followed a clear discursive blueprint. The fascination with Western modernity involved the simultaneous fear of and veneration for what the West represented in Turkish eyes. Beyond doubt, many modernizing non-Western nationalisms cling to an imagery essence while struggling to leap into the future. Turkey was no exception. An added component in these systemic characteristics was a pragmatic look at Western knowledge as a weapon to be adopted. The new university and its Western professors represented an attempt to recover knowledge that originally belonged to Turks in a pre-Lapsarian time. In a search given in 1933, in a speech given in 1933 to celebrate the opening of the new university, the deputy of the Minister of Education, Yusuf Hikmet Beyer, indicated this in the following way. We are the grandchildren of those who established the first civilizations. Until 300 or 400 years ago, all kinds of innovations in the field of civilization always originated from us, from Braciophilic Turks who spread from Central Asia to all corners of the world. Al-Farabis, Avicennas, Al-Barunis, Uleg Begs, all belong to our race. In those times, we used to have the most advanced agriculture, the most perfect art, and the most profound knowledge. Then a spirit and idea of dark fanaticism and terrible fundamentalism crushed, burned, and torched everything. Therefore, the pool of displaced scholars and other invited Western scholars presented a match for the already existing discourse of modernization, westernizing the process of knowledge production in a way that would give the new regime an aura of scientific invincibility, implementing educational strategies to initiate civilizational conversions in ordinary people, reclaiming a lost golden age by importing an indigenized modernity and establishing the Turks' essential propensity for modernity. So essentially, what he's saying here is like, at that time, during the time until the Turks thought the Nazis were going to win. Think about that. The Turks were inviting all these Jewish, German, and other European scholars to come to Turkey to replace their teachers to work in the new institution to basically like modernize the country, basically become Turks, advocate for Turkey, and teach on behalf of Turkey, right? And until the Turks thought the Nazis were going to win and exterminate all the Jews, which at that point they kicked them out, that's the time that they were on. You get what I'm saying? And they had no qualms with inviting also pseudo Nazis there, like the guy who designed, Ataturk's Katafalak. I have to look up that word again. Whatever. They had no problem incorporating Nazis into their academia. Once again, Turkey and America, they are one and the same. Turkey and America are one and the same. Because what did we do after we kicked Nazi ass in World War II? We invited all those Nazi scientists to come to America and work on NASA. Because more important than beating the Nazis, we got to beat the communists in the USSR. All right. Greg Matt says, have a good week. I'll catch you next live if I get the notification. Peace to Greg Matt. Peace to everybody out there. Continuing here. All right. Conflicting loyalties, expertise in the service of local and universal agendas. Scholars and experts from Europe and North America were not only perceived as the embodiment of Western knowledge, they were also subjects of a legitimating campaign in two senses. First, Turkish reformers wanted Westerners to witness the achievements of Turkish modernization and offer their stamp of approval. Refugees served as a collective litmus test, subjected to a constant demand for reminding the elite that their effort of modernization were not in vain. Second, they were also expected to actively contribute to national modernization through teaching, research, training graduate students, and giving lectures. To complicate the issue further, we need to note that Western scholars in Turkey encountered conflicting images of the West. Admiration towards modernization, equated with Westernization by their Turkish counterparts, coexisted alongside deep suspicions of Western intrusion. Because of the ambivalences in these encounters, Western scholars were not only expected to help in the efforts to carve their respective place for Turkey among modern nations, but also to define and defend a core of racial, historical, and linguistic Turkishness against the intrusions of Western modernity. In this sense, Western refugees were seen not only as agents of modernization, but also as prime movers of a Turkified science and scholarship. This indigenized science would then pass on to and be reproduced by future generations of Turkish scholars. In fact, Turkish reformers considered the emigre scholars a first step in higher education, only to be replaced later by a local staff trained in European universities. The university, as a knowledge generating and disseminating entity, and emigre scholars as representatives of Western modernity, play crucial roles for combining global and particular trends. In this sense, what Robertson proposes in the case of Japanese modernization resonate with the Turkish experience. The first component of this process is the particularization of the universal, which involves a selective adoption of ideas and practices from other cultures. In the second phase, the particular is universal universalized by offering the outcome of this combination back to the world as the product of Turkish essential abilities. The dynamics of exchange between local actors and emigre scholars reveal that the universal and the particular are not incongruent, but on the contrary, nationalism's search for essentialist roots and authenticity to develop in the milieu of an international audience. The following passage from a 1937 article entitled The Quality and Significance of Turkish Reform illustrates the way in which its elite presented the Turkish search for modern essence as a gift for humanity. We are pleased to see that the thesis developed 5 years ago by the Turkish History Association as to the homeland and civilization of the Turks and the role they played in world history has begun to be accepted as a universal historical reality. We are pleased and we are appropriately and justifiably proud to belong to the lineage of ancient Turks who, thanks to this thesis, are presented to the world with their real faces. However, we are not only a nation that prides itself for being part of a people who accomplished the great deeds in a distant past, we have also shown that we have added new ones to the wonders of our grandfathers and make progress on the path they walked for humanity. The latest great wonder of our nation is our reform, known to world history as the Turkish reform. Examining the scholarly exchanges in the social sciences and humanities from this perspective not only reveals the cooperation of the global and the local, but also complicates the power relationship between West and East and reveals the ambivalences in these cultural encounters. While Western social sciences constructed Eastern societies as quintessential others, actors in those Eastern societies were actively negotiating with Western knowledge and its producers in a way to strengthen local claims, not only claims to modernization, but also to national linguistic, historical, and racial parity, or even superiority. The early Republican response was a creative attempt to accept and internalize the premise of the equation, while attempting to switch to the side of the winners. For the Turkish reformers, only the universal authority of Western science could support particular identity claims exalting Turkishness, the ancientness of the Turkish language, history, and race, the Turks' contribution to Western civilization, and the Turks' historical entitlement to the Anatolian Peninsula. Universal claims associated with Western modernity were linked to native goals in this scholarly mobilization. On one hand, the modern was being integrated into ethno-racial and national projects. On the other hand, local efforts were presented as service to the entire humanity and scientific knowledge. The experiences of emigre scholars and their willingness to cooperate with the government and the Turkish scholars varied in many respects, such as the condition that led to their employment in Turkey and their perceptions of Turkish modernization. Pardon. The nature of emigre's agency needs to be considered because, especially the refugee scholars' choice to find employment in Turkey was not entirely voluntary. The limits of academic freedom are not clear in an environment in which intellectuals circulate globally to prevent harm to themselves and their families. Although I pay more attention to emigre scholars, scholarly exchange between Europe and Turkey was not limited to academics in exile. Nazi sympathy among Turkish government officials remained alive until the definitive victory of the Allied powers at the end of the war. Increasingly, Nazi propaganda, both in Turkey in general and among Germans living in Turkey in particular, was rapidly spreading in the 1930s. In her study of the German community in Turkey, Anne Dietrich shows how the Nazi propaganda and nationalization efforts were especially effective among the youth, while emigres were at the same time seeking refuge in Turkey and forming their own separate groups, music groups, friendship groups, and Jewish groups. In addition to hosting scholars fleeing Nazi persecution, bilateral agreements between the Turkish and German governments led to a complex matrix of interpersonal relationships and academic exchange, in which German scholars and experts, sent with the permission of the Nazi government, lived and worked in close proximity to scholars in exile. As the memoirs of a Turkish journalist indicate, the two groups naturally did not like each other. Additionally, they were competing in terms of their relations with the Turkish government. It is safe to assume that the refugee scholars were reluctant to criticize the German government either for fear of the German consulate or because of national pride. Grothusen mentions Ernst Reuter, who served the government as an urban planner in Ankara and served as the mayor of West Berlin after his return to Germany. As an example, Reuter was one of the refugee scholars who had survived a concentration camp in Germany with visible scars in his body, were adamant in his refusal to complain about the difficulties he was exposed under the Nazi regime. Some scholars occupied an in between position. They were initially sent by the Nazi government's permission, but eventually they lost their legal status while in Turkey and became refugees. An example is Otto Gerngross, who started working in the Higher Agricultural Institute in 1933 with the permission of the German government, but his status changed to refugee in 1938. The Turkish government's ad hoc response to European scholars neither simply shows a policy of defending the rights of exiles nor of advancing Nazi propaganda. Similar impromptu responses among scholars in exile reveal the complexity of their experience. One may expect that the scholars in exile, as victims of Nazi ideology, would be reluctant to become engaged in the nationalist and ethno-racial projects of the Turkish government when compared to Nazi representatives in Turkey. However, this formula did not work uniformly. Some of the emigre scholars constructed Nazi excesses as aberrations, not as a systemic failure of ethnic nationalism. Others considered Nazi horrors as a failure of nationalist modernity. Therefore, emigre scholars participated in the Turkish government's scholarly mobilization to different degrees. Given the uncertainties of a foreign country and the ravages of war, scholars in exile were not immune from nationalist agendas. Some certainly maintained an abstract ambition to produce and disseminate universal humanist knowledge, regardless of local demands. In other instances, however, emigre scholars did not hesitate to participate in highly nationalistic forums. In the final analysis, the lines demarcating ethno-nationalist and humanist production of knowledge were blurry in the minds of the Republican reformers. Ideology in science or propaganda in scholarship were so close in meaning and function that Western scholars' intentions remained detached from the reception of their ideas. For the Republican elite, there was no contradiction between the goals of attaining Western modernity with the help of Western scholars and using this modernity for more local ideological goals of the Republic, because the university itself was expected to serve as an ideological tool. The following pages will offer a number of examples regarding the incongruent views and expectations between the local elite and emigre scholars. Striking differences as to the meaning of Turkey, the West, and modernization was evident early on when the meetings between the government and the German school was taking place. For Schwartz, as with many other refugee scholars, Turkey represented an exotic other than the West had not contaminated yet. I had discovered, Schwartz says cheerfully in his memoirs, a new and wonderful country to which the filth of the West had not touched. Although Schwartz was supportive of the new regime's ideals of modernization, he was nonetheless cautious about the role of Western scholars in it. I was stressing that it would not be possible to Westernize only by bringing new Western teaching staff. The important thing was to find professors who could create a new spirit. Although some of the emigre scholars saw themselves as victims of Western progress and were cautious about Turkish attempts to Westernize, they, paradoxically, represented in Turkish eyes the very modernity which they fled. German professor of law Ernst Hirsch seems astonished in his memoir by the fact that the identities of refugee scholars had undergone a complete transformation from unwanted Jews in Germany to respected European professors in Turkey. Narrating his experiences in an official celebration commemorating the establishment of the Republic, Hirsch outlines the sudden change in the perception and the power of the West as a discursive entity. And here I was, I who was under contempt in his German homeland for being a Jew, who had lost his status he held, and who was forced to flee his homeland and his country to take refuge in a foreign country because of belonging to an inferior race. I, the refugee, was in Turkey at the other end of the world, in a place that used to serve as the throne room of the Ottoman sultans, present as a respectable German professor who was considered to be among the first 1,000 elite individuals of the country. Using that white privilege, baby. Using that white privilege. He's nobody in Germany, but he's somebody in Turkey. Despite his enthusiasm, Hirsch was perceptive about the existence of ruptures in this discourse of a country welcoming foreign refugees. Several times he hints at the barriers between Turks, Europeans, and minority groups in his memoirs. For example, after referring to the warning of another German citizen that foreigners in Turkey should only live among foreigners and minorities, Hirsch observes that minorities, that is, Armenians, Greeks, and Jews, were living in close communities, even if they were Turkish citizens. Real Turks were putting distance between these communities and themselves, just just like what was done in Germany before Hitler against the Jews. It is also interesting to see how Hirsch internalizes the distinction between citizenship and belonging. Although it was this very distinction in Germany between real Germans and Jewish Germans that paved the way to this displacement. Emigre professors were hesitant to publicly acknowledge the anti-minority acts of Turkification policies of the period. The taxonomies of race and modernity produced a system in Turkey that the government could enthusiastically employ Jewish scholars despite the immense risk of a dangerous confrontation with the Nazi government, while at the same time imposing discriminatory taxes on its own Jewish citizens and sending the ones with default taxes to forced labor camps. Emigres in hard sciences had an easier time when it comes to local expectations, because their mere presence as representatives of universal science was a testament to the government's stance towards modernization. Emigres in the social sciences and humanities were also instrumental in framing Turkey and Turkishness within Western science and scholarship. Moreover, they had to walk a finer line with regard to racial, historical, and linguistic theses dominant in the period. A quick example to illustrate how the government acted selectively when it came to employing scholars in ideologically critical disciplines comes from an epistolary contact to hire a scholar in one of these critical disciplines. According to a letter dated February 1937, sent to the Minister of Culture from the president of the Turkish Historical Society, the Hittologist and Assyriologist Emil Osterix Forer, then a Swiss citizen, contacts the Turkish authorities requesting an academic employment in Turkey. The president of the association, Hassan Cemil, appears enthusiastic in his letter, but while he voiced his support for the hiring of Forer, he raises one condition. I recommend directly contacting him to tell the professor that his proposal has been received with great sympathy here, and with the condition that he accepts our national historical thesis, it would be possible for him to work in Ankara and exercise his plans. The Minister of Culture later sent a letter to the Turkish embassy in Berlin requesting swift action on the matter, but repeating the same condition. Forer was even sent a German translation of Afet İnan's presentation of Turkish historical thesis at the Second Congress of History in 1937. Forer had published extensively on the Hittites, but he was never employed in Turkey. In 1947, he moved to Central America to spend his time to study Mesoamerican cultures and died in San Salvador. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. So this guy is like a real scholar studying Hittites and the Assyrians and stuff like that. And so, he's looking for a job and he applies to Turkey. And Turkey's like, yeah. Swiss scientist, Swiss historian. Yeah, move to Turkey. But just tell us one thing. Are you going to accept that the Turks created all the civilization? That the Turks were the real Mesopotamians? That ancient Egypt, the pyramids were built by Turks? Are you willing to accept it, buddy? Are you willing to do it? And he's like, yeah, I think I'm going to go to Guatemala. That's pretty funny. All right. An important turning point in the ethno-racial scholarly mobilization of the period is an establishment of the Faculty of Language and History, Geography, established in 1935 in Ankara. The founding Western scholars of the faculty, such as Wolfram Eberhard in Sinology, Benno Landsberger in Sumerology, Hans Guterbach in Hittitology, George Rode in Philology, and Walter Rubin in Indology, were handpicked in ideologically critical disciplines, and it is plausible to assume that they, similar to other scholars, were aware of the task expected of them. In his memoirs, Ernst Hirsch acknowledges that these professors were invited to provide the scientific basis for Ataturk's theory of language and history. So we're going to wrap it up here. We're going to finish off chapter 5 in our next live stream. This has been episode 7, part 7 of Is the Turk a White Man, written by Murat Ergin. Very fascinated by the book. We did a lot today. We covered a lot today. Read about 50 pages or so. And this book is about 286. So we're about, I think 1/3 of the way there. I think we got about like 80 more pages to go, because I'm pretty sure the final parts of the book are like bibliography and stuff like that. Very, very interesting. I like this book. I hope y'all are enjoying it as well. Y'all stay tuned for more content. If you have a book that you want me to read on live stream, put it in the comments. Send it to me on Twitter, Laji Enrique. Shout out to Greg Mack. Shout out to IDK. Shout out to Avery. Shout out to everybody that tuned in. Shout out to Two Trappy as well. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.